Chapter 337. Lu Xiaoyi decisively gave up on pursuing the Chongshan force and the Ruoshui force, because they were not his force. There was no need to force the force of might, because it required constant battles. Marshal Uncle Jean Dan was right. You can't rely on your imagination to establish your psychological advantage. That's just a dream. If that's the case, then only a narcissist would be able to comprehend this kind of psychological force. The force of spirit in the mind, on the other hand, needed to be built up through bloody battles. This was the wonders of the spirit. But he would still stick to the force of trajectory, because he liked it. Furthermore, this kind of force could increase the success rate through hard work. He was currently wielding his sword thousands of times a day, then, he would work towards tens of thousands of times. There was a problem that he had been hesitating about. Although he had more time to practice his sword in the world of 9 palaces compared to other swordsmen, he did not feel any great improvement in this kind of time amplification. This made him wonder if the time amplification had any practical meaning to him. He had asked Jiu Yi before, and Jiu Yi said that his previous master practiced his sword in the world of 9 palaces like this, and then became a 5th ring swordsman that the entire universe had to bow down to. However, there was a problem with this. At that time, Lord Jiu and its master were both at the bottom of the foundation establishment stage, so they could complement each other. According to Lord Jiu, after its master's cultivation level increased, he basically no longer came in to use the time multiplier. Then, could it be that the time amplification lost its original effect due to the huge difference in realm between them? Lu Xiaoyi knew nothing about this kind of high-end mystery, but he decided to give up on the help of the world of 9 palaces for the next period of time, and train his sword properly in the world of 9 palaces. It was a simple way of thinking. He felt that the heavens were already very generous to him. He had a strange sword spirit, powerful mental strength, and countless knowledge from his previous life, so he should not steal from the heavens in terms of time. There should be a limit to his opportunities, right? If it was in the world of 9 palaces, his schedule would be very tight. Wielding his sword thousands of times a day was not on the same level as wielding his sword tens of thousands. Fortunately, he had already made some progress in many cultivation techniques, so he didn't need to spend as much time as before. That was how cultivation was. One had to constantly correct mistakes and find the one that was most suitable for oneself. Moreover, the one that was most suitable for oneself was not always the same. It was always changing. Cultivation was a complicated variable. He spent 3 full months in a tense and busy state. One day, Yan Bo invited him to drink with Yan Cheng. After a tense period of cultivation, it was necessary for him to relax. The 3 of them were old friends who had gone through life and death together, so they were very open and went their separate ways. Lu Xiaoyi didn't know where Yan Bo had gotten such good wine, but after drinking 2 cups, he actually felt a little tipsy. After returning to the cave, he didn't want to practice martial arts. He just lay on his dirt mound, stretched out his limbs, and looked up at the starry sky. Up until now, he had been able to communicate with 120 stars at the same time. In the cultivation of the stars, this was already a very impressive achievement, at least for a foundation establishment cultivator. He also didn't want to circulate his energy to get rid of the tipsy feeling. It was also very interesting to maintain this state. He just silently looked at the stars in a daze, counting them until he couldn't count them anymore. 120 stars naturally appeared in his mind. Subconsciously, without any warning, plan, or precise calculation, the 4 seasons left the box. Following a curve outlined by the clusters of stars, it drew a beautiful arc and cut an iceberg with a diameter of more than 100 feet floating in the ice river 4,000 feet away in half. Lu Xiaoyi suddenly sat up. Usually, he could only cut half of an iceberg with such a diameter. But now, it was as if he had the help of God. He finally knew where his power was. It was the power of the stars. It was right in front of him, but it was as dark as the darkness under a lamp. He had been searching for it for several years. The power of the stars was everywhere, not only in the night, but also in the day. Now, in the domain enveloped by the atmosphere, When he walked in the universe in the future, the power of the stars would follow him like a shadow. This was his power. He had drifted in the universe for countless years, and it was deeply compatible with the environment of his power. Lu Xiaoyi completely sobered up. He flipped over and stood up. He had to pick up this feeling before it disappeared. He had to completely master it and understand it. He had to turn it into a power that he could use at any time, anywhere, and not just a flash in the pan after occasionally drinking a little wine. Up until now, after learning about the use of power in the sword from Guang Bei, it had been a full 3 years before he finally had his first power. This was something worth celebrating, but as the saying goes, fortune and misfortune depend on each other. Before he had time to savor this happiness, a piece of news ruthlessly shattered his good mood. Or rather, he didn't care, but the people around him felt disappointed. Yanqing immediately sent him the news. Candide Hawthorne's name had disappeared from the 5-ring foundation establishment ranking. Could it be that this senior sister couldn't wait to find an opportunity to attack him just because he made her drink 2 more cups yesterday? Only then did he realize that unknowingly, 3 years had passed since he returned from the Wolf's Ridge. He had always felt that time was missing. His cultivation time was far less than 3 years. Thinking about it carefully, he had already gone back and forth between Maoshi Town and the Dome many times during this period of time. The time spent on this journey should have been almost half a year, right? Time really passed quickly. Being kicked out of the ranking was within his expectations. Because in these 3 years, he had almost no achievements. The only person he had killed was Wan Jingliu's ordinary non-combat cultivator, the fake Chun Shu. During this period, he didn't show any desire to fight or win. He just wanted to hide and live his own life. It would be strange if he could remain on the ranking in such a situation. On the 5-ring foundation establishment ranking, especially the last 200 people, there were the biggest changes. As the saying goes, if you don't advance, you will fall behind. Countless cultivators racked their brains to enter the ranking, and the competition was very fierce. This kind of competition didn't necessarily involve challenging the people at the bottom of the ranking. They could also achieve their goals through their own extraordinary achievements. Just like how Lu Xiaoyi entered the ranking in the past, others could also enter the ranking in the same way. In fact, he was a little happy about it. It wasn't that he had forgotten his promise to Guang Bei, but as a lazy person, he had his own way of achieving his goals. He didn't want to stay on the ranking for too long. If he was always there, there would be countless uncontrollable challenges. He didn't like it. According to his ideal method, he would improve his strength and make great progress in all aspects. His cultivation would at least reach the late stage of the foundation establishment realm. At that time, he would directly start to challenge others. He didn't pursue a step-by-step process. Instead, he would jump up and enter the top 300, then the top 100, then the top 10. In just a few years, he would complete all of this and fulfill his promise. Then, he would start to challenge the Jin Dan. The advantage of doing this was that he didn't need to be at the forefront of the ranking in the 100 years of the foundation establishment realm. Accumulate strength, burst forth, form the core and leave, perfect. Chapter 338. Lu Xiaoyi thought so, but it didn't matter. But the people around him didn't think so. Once a Xianyuan swordsman entered the rankings, there were only 2 situations. One was to move forward, and the other was to die for glory. Occasionally, there would be a situation where they would fall back, but Dafa always moved forward. There had never been a situation where they were kicked out of the rankings. Lu Xiaoyi was famous, but this time, it wasn't a good name, but a bad one. Wasn't this a disgrace to the Xianyuan swordsman? Although no one said it to his face, there were still rumors that occasionally reached his ears. Especially those about the last time he met with Ling Ruofing and the others. They used it as evidence that he didn't want to improve himself, and that he was afraid of retreating. The world was so strange. Achievements became the wind vane that determined everything. If you were ranked high, there would naturally be a lot of flattery. Saying such words was modesty. If your results weren't good, these words would become cowardice. Once a person entered the rankings, there would be a lot of gossip. Whether you liked it or not, you would inevitably become the topic of discussion. This was expected. Lu Xiaoyi was thick-skinned and could handle it. He could, but there were others who couldn't. Letting more external swords enter the rankings was also a result of cultivating disciples. External swordsman Sword Chi Soar to the Sky had more than 10 positions in the Hall of Appointments. He was in charge of daily cultivation and distribution of resources. There were also other halls. For example, the Hidden Hall was in charge of law enforcement, the Dark Hall was in charge of sending people to other areas, and the Ming Hall was in charge of imparting skills to cultivators. This time, Lu Xiaoyi was summoned to the Ming Hall. In fact, his relationship with this hall wasn't shallow. These days, all the discussions in the Hall of Scriptures were arranged by the Ming Hall. He also received information from the Ming Hall about the time, place, and who would be preaching. Only then could he accurately attend the lectures of different martial uncles Jin Dan. Thus, he had no choice but to go when the inscription hall summoned him. In fact, no matter which hall summoned him, he had to go. This was his responsibility as a disciple of Xianyuan. You can't just take from the sect and not pay back, unless you are so ordinary that people can't remember you. The hall master of Ming Chuan Hall was Gu Shan, a kind-looking man who was also a Jin Dan external sword. In Xianyuan Sword School, there was no difference in status between a swordsman with a job and a non-job. On the contrary, non-job swordsmen had more potential. Their goal was to reach a higher level, and the school didn't want to restrict them with some mundane affairs. What has Little E been practicing recently? Are there any difficulties in cultivation? If you need someone to give you pointers, I can arrange for an uncle master who is good in this area to give you a lecture. In my external sword lineage, the sect will still be biased in terms of educational resources for talented disciples. Lu Xiaoyi hurriedly thanked him. Since ancient times, one would not visit a temple without a cause. There must be a reason for him to be so attentive. Since he had given him this sweet date, the next step should be to reveal his true intentions, right? Recently, this disciple has been obsessed with Shi and wants to have a breakthrough in this area. Thus, as long as it is Uncle Master Gu Tsung's lecture, I will definitely go. I have indeed learned many different things and have benefited greatly. Gu Shan nodded. You have chosen well. In the Jin Dan External Sword School, junior brother Gu Tsung's sure sword is very famous and is ranked in the top 3. There are 2 others, one is not at the dome and the other is cultivating in seclusion. When they return, I will arrange a few more lectures. I believe that they will be able to satisfy your requirements. Lu Xiaoyi was a yes man. To a superior, after the promise of a sweet date, it was his true intentions. There is an exchange mission organized by the Temple of Sangha. It has a history of over 10,000 years and is held every 30 years. It is called 100 Vying Barges. This is limited to the western regions and is a foundation establishment activity. It gathers all the young talents of the western regions and everyone gathers together to improve through competition and get to know each other through competition. Every time 100 Vying Barges, my Xianyuan sect will send disciples to participate. This time, it is the same. 2 of the internal sword school will be going and 3 of my external sword school will be going. Thus I thought of you. Lu Xiaoyi had a flattered look. Uncle Master, this so-called exchange, is there a reason? Gu Shan twirled his beard and smiled. Most of the people who participate are either on the ranking list, or have the strength to be on the ranking list. The candidates are not chosen voluntarily but are recommended by the sect. Thus, there are basically no people who are just there to make up the numbers. Didn't Little E also stay on the ranking list for 3 years? Thus, I feel that you have the ability to participate. There is no need to be too worried. This is only a local activity in the western regions and the number of people who can participate is limited to 100. Furthermore, those cultivators who are ranked at the top will not participate. They have their own stage. The key is the reward. This time, the reward for 100 Vying Barges is a few force possession items. They are very precious and suitable for you. Thus I summoned you. Little E, you don't need to thank me. Lu Xiaoyi's face was full of joy, but his heart did not match his face. The reward may be one reason, but there was another. This kind of exchange competition could have an effect on a cultivator's ranking in the Foundation establishment list. It seemed that some big shot of the external sword school was unhappy and wanted to push him out. If he participated in more similar competitions, he would naturally have a ranking. Objects with power were one of the most important ways to comprehend power. Force was not only valued by swordsmen, but also by Dharma cultivators. Besides comprehending force by oneself, there was another way to greatly increase a cultivator's success rate in comprehending force. It was an artifact that was sealed by a high-level cultivator under certain special circumstances. It was not restricted to its form. It could be a rock, a tree branch, a handful of spring water, a magic artifact, a weapon. This item could provide a cultivator with one or more experiences of force. It could make something that was usually invisible and intangible appear in front of the cultivator, allowing the cultivator to experience the most realistic baptism of force. It was not guaranteed to succeed, but it would definitely increase the cultivator's chances of comprehending force. In the cultivation world, this kind of strange item was very popular. It meant that the cultivator's strength could undergo a qualitative increase. It was not something that could be measured by spirit stones. In the cultivation world, force at a low level and Tao at a high level all required such items to supplement it. Xianyuan swordsmen disdained external items. This was their tradition. However, in a sense, because of their weak Tao system, it was very difficult for them to create such items. Combat and non-combat were completely different. Thus, rather than saying that they disdained it, it was better to say that they could not create force possession items. Grapes that could not be eaten were naturally sour. However, Orthodox Taoist sects were different. They were the best at creating these strange items. A few of the top Dharma cultivator sects had dabbled in this area. Among them, only Garen's sect specialized in this area. Garen force possession items were the guarantee of quality. It was also because of this that 100 vying barges was so precious, causing cultivators to scramble like ducks. Chapter 339. Lu Xiaoyi knew that Uncle Gu Shan had ulterior motives, but he still had to be grateful. Xianyuan External Sword Foundation establishment had more than 20,000 people. Giving you one of the three places was almost a 1 in 10 chance. What else was there to say? Gu Shan must have his own considerations for choosing him. Those sword practitioners who were ranked at the top of the list already had their own forces and might not be willing to go. Those whose strength was too far away from the list would be useless even if they went. Only people like him, who were hanging around the edge of the list and had some strength, would be more likely to attract the attention of the list because he had once stood out on the list. To Gu Shan, who was in charge of education, Lu Xiaoyi's entry into the ranking list was his contribution. What was the use of getting 3 people who were already on the ranking list into the list? They would not be able to achieve anything. Among the 100 cultivators from various sects of the western regions who participated in the competition, nearly half of them were people on the ranking list. Although their rankings weren't very high, basically all of them were in the top 300, but among them, there were a lot of people with real ability. Although Lu Xiaoyi had potential, after all, he had only cultivated for a short period of time. His cultivation level was a shortcoming, so it was unrealistic to expect him to be at the top of the list and win the rewards. The best result would be to defeat a few cultivators from other sections. It would be best if he could defeat 1 or 2 cultivators on the ranking list. Then, he would have a very good chance of being ranked on the next ranking list in 3 years. Gu Shan was a conscientious person. If he wanted to move up the ranks, he would need to have some impressive cultivation achievements. For this reason, he stood his ground against the opinions of the masses and rejected a few external sword cultivators who were on the ranking list. However, he gave these 3 spots to those who were not on the ranking list. This was a risky move. But was there anyone in Xianyuan who was afraid of risks? Lu Xiaoyi could not show that he was not interested in this. He already had his own influence, and he did not know what the so-called power in Sangha was. It had nothing to do with him, so what was there to pursue? But he was still making a final struggle. The Sangha exchange should be in half a year, right? At that time, I might be stationed in Mao Point Town. I don't know if there will be any conflicts. Gu Shan waved his hand. Station? That's wasting time. What a waste of time. You don't have to worry about this matter. With my Ming Chuan Hall stepping in, we will naturally help you solve it. You just have to work hard at the dome and don't worry about Mao Point Town anymore. A fate beyond one's control. There was still half a year left. He needed to make a good plan, not to stand out in the 800 vying barges, but for a further goal. What's there to fight over? It's just some things that are used as leverage. There was no distinction between high and low, and there was also a distinction between high and low. What matters is not the type, but the understanding. However, if one were to insist that the force of the grass and the force of the stars were on par with each other in terms of overall borrowing of force, that would only be a self-deception. Not every force was suitable for battle. Some forces were suitable for life, some were suitable for divination, some were helpful for alchemy and equipment refinement, some were helpful for the formation of mountains and rivers. But in the Tao of battle, the force of the stars was a top-rate force because the stars were boundless, ancient, and vast. During this period of time, he decided to put most of his energy into the sword spirit's sword chi and a deeper understanding of the force of the stars. You can't precisely divide the force into 10 equal parts or 100 equal parts, and then count them one by one. It's not like a steak that can be divided into medium and medium well. However, there are indeed differences in the understanding of force. It's impossible that the force of stars that he understood now will always be the same. As his cultivation base and knowledge increase, the force of stars will also increase. His current understanding of the force of the stars was just at the entry level. Moreover, he could feel that before he reached the level of Jin Dan, his understanding of the force of the stars would not have any fundamental changes. What he needed to do now was to be able to accurately display this force at any time, in any environment, and in any state. He couldn't turn it into a nervous force, which was sometimes effective and sometimes not. During his intense cultivation, Ling Ruofing invited him twice, but he didn't go. Among those cultivators, there were those who continued to support him, and there were also those who were eccentric. He really didn't have the mood to deal with these unfamiliar thoughts. Foundation establishment, after all, was still foundation establishment. Their state of mind was still far from the realm where they wouldn't be moved by appearances. They were just a strengthened version of mortals. At the foot of the Thousand Grace Peak, there was actually another place to test one's swordsmanship, and that was the ubiquitous sword dueling grounds. However, Lu Xiaoyi rarely went to such places. Even if he won, he wouldn't be able to prove anything. If he lost, it would only be embarrassing. His sword skills were now developing in the direction of Qin Yaojin's 3 axes, especially the opening 3 swords, and using them as the last 3 swords. This method wasn't suitable for sword fights, and it wasn't entertaining. However, he was still dragged to a sword arena as a spectator and helper. There weren't many in the Dome Peak who could do this, and among the outer swordsmen, there was only one who could do this. It wasn't one of those old people who were 3 stars lower, but senior sister Yan Chang, who had him under control from the very beginning. Their names that sounded the same somehow brought them together. After 5 years of ups and downs in the Wolf Ridge, their friendship had mellowed. Why did we come to this place? Senior sister, you know that I'm best at sneak attacks. I'm not used to you asking me to fight openly with others. Lu Xiaoyi complained out of habit. Yan Chang ignored his dissatisfaction. It's not like I'm asking you to fight in the sword arena. You're just going to help me watch from the side, and casually look at the flaws in my swordsmanship. Why, are you not listening to your senior sister now that you've grown up? Lu Xiaoyi really fell for this. He was also a cheap person. At the very least, as long as he expressed his interest in a few of the old girls, with his current achievements, there was still hope for him to hook up with them. However, to him, it was also his nature to not take advantage of the grass around his nest. It wasn't that he had any interest in this senior sister, he really didn't. It was just that he felt very relaxed when he was with her. Among the cultivators, there weren't many who were straightforward. Cultivators preferred to wrap themselves in layers of veils, so that others couldn't see their true faces. This was a form of self-protection, and this included him. As one's cultivation level increased, opportunities like the 5 years in the Wolf Ridge would become rarer and rarer. This also meant that the possibility of making a true friend would become smaller and smaller. Even a swordsman needed friendship. Although he had long surpassed his senior sister in terms of strength, he was still used to walking behind her. In the past, it was because he wanted to see her graceful figure. Now, it was because he wanted to keep a low profile as much as possible. Yan Chang laughed. Xiaoyi, when I travel with others, no male cultivator is willing to fly behind me. At the very least, they have to walk side by side with me. This is the style of a swordsman. You, on the other hand, are just like a shadow. Lu Xiaoyi's words were as sharp as ever. Behind you is your little brother. No one will misunderstand. If I walk side by side with you, people will misunderstand. Senior sister, you have countless followers under your skirt. Who knows how many people will come to make trouble for me? Senior sister, in any case, you're a flower on the outside, a peerless figure. You have to watch your words. What do you mean by shadow? It's too indecent. Besides, even if I'm a shadow, I can't really smell the fart. Senior sister, why don't you be kind and let me smell the fart of a beauty? How is it different from the fart of a mortal like me? Chapter 340. Sooner or later, I'll tear that mouth of yours apart. Yan Qing threatened, but she couldn't stop this fellow from spouting nonsense. She liked to hang out with this junior martial brother because he was one of the very few people who didn't have any ulterior motives. He often said strange things. Although he was impudent at times, he truly treated her as an equal and not a dispensable cultivation vessel. In the Xianyuan sword sect, there was gender discrimination. Although no one said it out loud, it was everywhere in their actions. This was an orthodoxy where men flourished while women flourished. After all, there were too few swordsmen cultivators who enjoyed bloodshed and had made significant achievements in their lives. Senior martial sister, what's your surname in the mortal world? It doesn't make sense that you can call me by my real name while I can only call you by your Dharma name. As friends, this isn't fair. Yan Qing was startled. Very few people in the fifth ring knew her real name. It wasn't because she had a powerful background, but because she wanted to protect herself. She didn't want her name to spread everywhere. This junior martial brother was one of the very few people she was willing to tell her name to. I can tell you, but you can't spread it around. My real name is Fang, so I'm called Fang Yi. After I came to the fifth ring, I begged the elders to give me the Dharma name Yan Qing. It's actually the same. Lu Xiaoyi was very dissatisfied. So senior martial sister went through the back door. The sect is unfair. Why do you get to choose your own name? If I'm the same, I should be called Yan Lu. Oh no, Yan Yi. It's better than what I am now. The two chatted and laughed. Soon, they arrived at a huge arena under Thousand Virtues Peak. Because swordsmen's flying swords had a range of more than 100 zhang, the arena was designed to be 300 zhang long and 100 zhang wide. Several arenas were connected side by side. Looking down from the sky, it was a spectacular sight. Swordsman duels within the sect were extremely dangerous, especially for Foundation establishment swordsmen. Most of them had yet to achieve perfect control over their flying swords. It was impossible for it to be like what was written in the legends, where the winner's flying sword would stop at the opponent's neck. Either it was still far away, or it had already pierced through. Therefore, they needed a target. In the inner sword sect, they were rich and overbearing. They used sword puppets as their targets. Both sides' attacks would be directed at the sword targets without harming the cultivators at all. However, in the outer sword sect, there were too many cultivators. If they all used sword targets, the daily consumption would be too heavy. Therefore, they usually used fixed wooden targets. It couldn't completely replace a real battle, but at the very least, he could do his best without holding back. On the day of the duel in Xianyuan, Marshal Uncle Jean Dan would specially open up a small space in the arena. That was another matter. Usually, no one would play with them. There were too many people, and they couldn't afford to get hurt. There were many arenas under Thousand Virtues Peak, and this was only one of them. It was a place for the intermediate swordsmen to duel. The beginner swordsman referred to those who had just joined the sect not long ago. The intermediate swordsmen referred to those who had joined the sect for more than 10 years. The advanced swordsmen were all famous and powerful cultivators. They all had their own circles, and each minded their own business. Everyone needed to have an accurate estimate of their own strength. It was rude to blindly challenge the strong, and it would be a waste of their time. Unless you truly had the strength to do so. This arena was made up of 5 arenas, forming an area that was 5,000 feet wide and 3,000 feet long. The entire area was further divided into 5 arenas that were 100 feet wide and 3,000 feet long. These arenas could accommodate 5 pairs of swordsmen at the same time. It couldn't be helped. Those who could enter Xianyuan were all battle-hungry. Therefore, even though there weren't many people in the lecture hall, the arenas were often overcrowded. There was a small viewing platform at the side of the huge arena. From there, one could observe the situation of the 5 arenas. At the same time, one could pair up and find a suitable opponent. In a battle, the most taboo thing to do was to fight against a fixed opponent. One would always have to face an unfamiliar opponent with a completely different fighting style in order to improve oneself. Thus, free pairing was the main theme here. It was very rare for 2 people to fight against each other endlessly. However, Yan Xian was very famous among the outer swordsmen. She was known as the Ice Fairy, and the colder she was, the more people would flock to her. Other than Lu Xiaoyi, who didn't think so, Senior Yan was also very kind. Therefore, there were many who were willing to spar with her. As soon as she stepped onto the stage, she had already booked more than 10 arenas. She was a hot commodity. Seeing that Senior Yan was about to leave the arena, there were even people who loved her, like him. Lu Xiaoyi hurriedly rejected. "Sorry, I'm just a bag carrier. If we really want to spar, with my qualifications, I can only go to the west side." The west side was where the new disciples sparred. He said that because he had just entered the sect, he couldn't spar with everyone here. This was a very reasonable reason, and no one forced him. They were all cultured people. At least, they had to pretend to be cultured. Xuanyuan's tradition despised those who bullied the weak. Everyone was proud to challenge the strong. This was also the reason why Lu Shi didn't want to come here. If someone really recognized him, he would be more popular than Senior Yan. Previously, the 99-9 ranking was a threshold. If one defeated him, it meant that one could also enter the ranking. This was the best ruler. But fortunately, no one recognized him. Among the tens of thousands of people, Ling Ruofeng's small circle was pitifully small. Moreover, they were more active in low-level arenas, so they couldn't mix in here. This gave Lu Xiaoyi enough leisure time to watch other people's sword sparring. As he watched, he let the 3 sword spirits knock on the sword aura in the wave fighting slope. This was also his normal resting time. He rested, but the sword spirits didn't. Swordsmen had their own ideas about flying swords. From Lu Xiaoyi's point of view, he realized that there were still a few swordsmen who were quite strong, and there were many things that he could learn from them. Among them, Senior Yan's swordsmanship was straightforward. This had to do with the cultivator's personality. The type of cultivator would have the type of flying sword. Senior Yan would not be able to plot and set up traps. Therefore, to judge a swordsman's personality, one just had to look at their flying sword. Being straightforward did not mean that one did not know how to be flexible. This was also an important aspect of the sword vein's orthodoxy, as long as one's cultivation could keep up. In the cultivation realm, the battles between Dharma cultivators were the most tiring, and the most attention was paid to the details. The battles between Dharma cultivators and swordsmen were very fast. If the swordsman had the upper hand, he could quickly turn his advantage into victory. If the swordsman was at a disadvantage, he might consider escaping. He would never continue to fight knowing that he couldn't win. The fastest battle was between a swordsman and a swordsman. If both parties were hot-tempered and only attacked without defending, victory would usually be decided in an instant. It was a competition of whose flying sword was faster, and who could break the opponent's wooden target first. Under such circumstances, Smoky Cricket's battle speed was imaginable. The swordsmen went up one by one. They were all proud of fighting the Ice Mountain Fairy. Regardless of whether they won or lost, it was still a topic of conversation. Chapter 341. This was originally a very ordinary sword sparring session. Everyone was polite, courteous, and gentle. These were the rules of sparring with fellow disciples. Even though swordsman was known for being ruthless, no one was willing to show their boorish side in front of a beauty who was famous for her swordsmanship. Pretending, in a certain situation and in a certain sense, was also a very good quality. He originally thought that he would be able to keep up this act until Senior Marshal's sister was satisfied and everyone returned to their own homes. He didn't expect that someone would come looking for him. No, that's not right, it was looking for everyone. A sword control technique appeared on the horizon. It quickly approached and landed. This was originally not a big deal. This was a sword arena. Swordsmen would come and join them at any time, and there would also be people leaving at any time. However, this sword cultivator did not understand the rules. He directly flew between Smoky Chang and her opponent. The flying sword in the box flew out, and with his own strength, he resisted the attacks of the two people. He was as steady as a mountain, and even had the power to counterattack. He affectionately looked at Yen Cheng's direction. "Little Chang, why are you wasting your time here? What kind of opponent do you want? Fast sword, sly sword, I can do it. Wherever you want to travel, the southeast region, the air sea region, I can accompany you. If you want stars, I can pluck them for you. If you want immortality, I can protect your cauldron." As soon as these words left his mouth, he acted like a typical Casanova. Many of the cultivators present immediately understood who he was. Foundation establishment cultivators were the cream of the crop. They started as mortals and reached the Tao Foundation establishment stage. Hard work, talent, resources, and luck were all indispensable. If one was not a true genius, one would not be able to reach this stage. Therefore, there were very few people who did not follow the rules. However, when the forest was big, there would be all kinds of birds. When there were many foundation establishment cultivators, it was inevitable that there would be some freaks. There were tens of thousands of foundation establishment cultivators under Qianxiu Peak. It was normal for there to be a few who did not walk the normal path. Among them, there was a swordsman. He was born in an aristocratic family, and was ranked 65th on the list. He was the perfect example of a second-generation cultivator. However, he was not famous because of his ranking, but because of his character, the character of a Casanova. It was reasonable to say that with his physical conditions, even if he wasn't certain, if he was truly devoted to a female cultivator, his success rate should be very high. However, this person was strange in this aspect. Ever since he entered the foundation building realm, he had dated several outstanding Kun cultivators, but not a single one of them succeeded. For some unknown reason, the people involved had a deep taboo, and it was very difficult for outsiders to find out. In recent years, such a character had begun to pester the Smoky Ant again. No matter how big or small, he was like a dogskin plaster, sticking on and not letting go. You couldn't say that he used force because he had never done anything excessive. However, you also couldn't say that he was deeply in love because the object of his affection was always changing. It seemed that he didn't care about being faithful to one person. Therefore, many people suspected that this senior brother Yan Chong was cultivating some kind of great Tao related to love. Yan Chong smiled and said, "You can't say that this senior brother Yan Chong is cultivating some kind of great Tao related to love. If it was any other swordsman causing trouble here, they would have become the target of public criticism. However, since it was this person, everyone was in the mood to watch a joke. Strange confessions, rebellious actions, a glorious history of failure, and an unyielding spirit despite repeated defeats. Together, they formed a strange scene under Qianxiu Peak. The smoky ant was also very depressed. This person was really too hateful. As long as she was involved with him, she would become the joke of everyone. No matter what she did, she would lose her original mood. However, because she understood him, she also knew what the most efficient way to get rid of this person was. This person was very serious about what he said. If you could prove that he was wrong, he would retreat in a daze. This could be considered one of the few shining points of this person. Therefore, she was actually prepared. She could not keep silent because this person was unusually clingy. She had to fight him head-on. "You said that you can do everything that the swordsman here can do?" Yan Chong's eyes lit up. The goddess had answered him. This was a good start. "Yes. Everything that the cultivators here can do with flying swords, I can do as well. Therefore, little ant, there is no need for you to waste your time here. Let's find a secluded place, and your senior martial brother will teach you a lesson alone. Wouldn't that be perfect?" Yan Chong turned around and looked at the stage. There were many cultivators here who were eager to give it a try. Although they knew that there was a gap between them and the people on the rankings, the swordsman was never afraid of a gap. Furthermore, this was a good opportunity to help the Ice Mountain Goddess. Lu Shi knew that something was wrong and shrank back. He knew that he had been tricked by his senior martial sister to come to the arena. She had obviously expected this. Otherwise, why didn't she come to him earlier or later, but now? She was using him as a shield. "Junior martial brother, why aren't you showing yourself?" Yan Chong said softly. The swordsmen were very confused. They didn't know who her junior martial brother was. It could be a certain person, or it could be everyone. Seeing that the sly brat was hiding in the crowd and not moving, Yan Chong shouted again. "Junior martial brother, show yourself!" Lu Xiaoyi knew that he couldn't hide anymore. He knew the senior martial sister's temper. If he didn't show himself, she would probably call his name. He wanted to keep a low profile, but there were always people who wanted to harm him. Therefore, he slowly walked out, surprising everyone. They knew that this person was the Ice Mountain Goddess follower, but they didn't expect him to be so capable. Or perhaps, the Ice Mountain Goddess actually liked to eat young grass? Yan Chong pointed at an old tree 400 feet away. There was an abandoned nest of a snowbird on it. It was the size of a millstone, and only a few old vines were left to support it. "Since you said that you can do what others can do, then release your flying sword and cut that nest apart." Yan Chong looked at the nest, then at the Ice Mountain Goddess, and then at the young swordsman. He laughed and said, "Little Chong, I can't do it from this distance, but I believe that others can't do it either. If anyone here can do it, I'll turn around and leave. If not, hee." Swordsmen were limited by their foundation establishment level, so there was a limit to how far they could control their flying swords. Generally speaking, people like Yan Chong could control their flying swords up to a distance of 200 feet. Yan Chong was much better. After all, he was ranked on the swordsman ranking, so he could control his flying swords up to 300 feet. However, he couldn't control his flying swords up to 300 feet. If it was a fixed target, he could probably hit it from 400 feet away. The last 300 feet would have to be calculated in advance. For a swordsman who played with swords every day, this wasn't a difficult task. However, this nest was constantly swaying in the cold wind of the snowfield. There was no guarantee that he could do it just by calculating. Therefore, Yan Chong didn't believe it. In the swordsman's sect, Even the most outstanding swordsman ranked around the top 100 might not be able to do it. The sword was a killing weapon. It couldn't be solved by luck. Chapter 342. Since it was impossible for him to keep a low profile and not help this troublesome senior, Lu Xiaoyi no longer hesitated and clasped his hands towards Yan Chong. "Senior, please advise me." With a flash of the sword, the four-seasoned sword was unleashed. In the next moment, the abandoned snowbird's nest 4,000 feet away was cut in half. Yan Chong snorted coldly and turned around to leave. Lu Xiaoyi did not dare to stay any longer and hurriedly followed behind, leaving behind a group of shocked swordsmen standing there in a daze. The difference between 4,000 feet and 2,000 feet was huge. For an offensive orthodoxy like the swordsman, it meant that they had the initiative and a higher chance of winning. Who was this? Yan Chong sighed deeply. He had failed again. But it did not matter. He could handle it. He glanced at the dumbfounded crowd and mocked himself. It's not embarrassing to lose to someone who used to be on the leaderboard. Long range does not mean everything. This person is Lu Xiaoyi. Remember this. If you want to pursue the ice goddess, you have to be able to get past him. Although he had suffered a setback, he did not forget to cause trouble for others. Lu Xiaoyi followed behind his senior, looking a little unhappy. Yan Chong found it funny. What? Are you blaming me for exposing your flying sword's range? You can't easily ambush people anymore? Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly. I just don't want to attract attention. Who said that I only know how to ambush people? Yan Chong said seriously. Xiaoyi, although your current strength has far surpassed me, and I don't have the ability to give you pointers, there are some things that you can't continue like this. It's good to have a trump card, but if you rely on it and use it as a foundation, you'll lose your true identity as a swordsman. You'll lose your sword heart. It's wrong to try to ambush people secretly no matter who you meet. It's not wrong to keep a low profile, but if you don't even dare to show your sword skills because of that, how can you still be a swordsman? Being upright might seem silly to you and have no tactical effect, but this is what a real swordsman must face. My master once told me that the higher one's cultivation level is, the more upright one is. That's because schemes and tricks are nothing in the face of strength. Senior sister is doing this because I want you to cast aside these scruples. Aren't you tired of living by being so careful? Lu Xiaoyi pursed his lips. You make it sound like you're not doing this for your own personal reasons. A smile appeared on Smokey's cold face. Since we can kill two birds with one stone, why not? Lu Xiaoyi understood what this senior sister meant. To be honest, she had hit his weak spot. He did not live like a swordsman. There were too many reasons that could be related to his experience. He had not truly completed the transformation of a swordsman. This required a process, a necessary process. Otherwise, it would be difficult for his strength to rise to the next level with such a state of mind. To a swordsman, one's state of mind was very important. Bravely moving forward might sound brainless, but from a certain point of view, it was necessary. Otherwise, one would not be worthy of being a true swordsman. That senior brother Yan Chong seems to be very strange. He doesn't seem to be doing this solely because of your charm, senior sister. There seems to be some other reason mixed in. Smokey sneered. Of course he has other reasons. The so-called Casanova is just an act. Little E, you have to be careful with this person. His thoughts are unpredictable. He seems to be affectionate, but he's actually heartless. Lu Xiaoyi did not understand. What kind of game was this? How much time did a cultivator have? Smokey explained a little more. I can't tell you too much right now, but it has to do with the origin of Xianyuan, the Azure Sky Great World. If you observe carefully, you'll know that all the people he's courting are Kun cultivators from the Azure Sky Great World. Otherwise, why didn't he pursue those old companions of yours who came with you? Many of them are beautiful and charming. Lu Xiaoyi had never thought of such a reason. He really wanted to know what it meant. But seeing that Smokey didn't want to say more, he could only give up. In the cultivation world, there were too many secrets. It was better to know as little as possible, to avoid trouble. So he changed the topic. Senior sister, senior brother Yanbo invited us to drink some wine a few days ago. I saw that he seemed to have something on his mind, but he was unwilling to say it out loud. We tried to sound him out but failed. Senior sister, do you know the reason? Smokey curled her lips. What other reason could there be? He's not doing well in cultivation. He's met with a problem. Actually, this matter has something to do with you. Lu Xiaoyi didn't understand. What does it have to do with me? Did I hurt his self-confidence? Smokey explained. Yanbo has been worrying about the problem of Shi recently. In fact, at our stage, who doesn't want to make a breakthrough in Shi if they want to go to the next level? In a few months, it will be the 800 vying barges in Jialan. The prize is a few items of Shi. Yanbo fought for these 2 places in the inner sword competition, but he didn't get them. So he's unhappy. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. This has nothing to do with me, right? The spots for the inner sword competition and the outer sword competition are 2 different things. I didn't steal his spot. Even if I wanted to give it to him, I don't have the right. He can't accept it. Really, those who want to go can't go, but those who don't want to go are forced to go. Smokey was also a little dispirited. He's just a little disappointed. He's afraid that you'll catch up with him. Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly. This senior brother was too proud. Who said that senior brothers had to be stronger than junior brothers? Why would he be afraid of being caught? He had already caught up with him, okay? The 2 of them parted ways. The more Lu Xiaoyi thought about it, the more depressed he became. He suddenly realized that he had to change his plan again. In his original plan, he was just going to be a bystander in the so-called 800 vying barges in Jialan. He wouldn't put in any effort, and would just muddle through. Ming Chuan Palace wouldn't be able to do anything to him. But now it seemed that his situation had been resolved, but his friends' situations hadn't. It wasn't just Smokey who was depressed. Perhaps Smokey, who had never expressed anything in this regard, was also affected. His senior sister was a strong person. She never said anything about her needs. But with her temper and her current state, it was impossible for her to be indifferent to the situation. She was just secretly working hard in the hope of a breakthrough. He could not do it for himself, but he couldn't not do it for his friends. Since both of his friends had similar needs, what reason did he have to pretend to fight in 800 vying barges and not put in any effort? He finally understood what his senior sister meant. In the cultivation world, hiding one's strength was the most unrealistic and also the most mind-twisting way of thinking. What was there to hide? This was a world of great competition. He had to fight for himself, for his friends and family, for his sex orthodoxy. In the future, when he reached that position, he would probably have to fight for the 5th ring. This was the true attitude of cultivation. His previous idea of living a simple life behind closed doors now seemed to be too childish. He always laughed at others for not having a choice, but he didn't know that other people's path was the right path. Only by fighting for it could one have no regrets. He was always too lazy to fight for it. When the day came, how could he close his eyes? Chapter 343. Lu Xiaoyi's state of mind had finally begun to change toward that of a real cultivator. One day, he would become a real swordsman. Only now did he begin to understand how naive his simple ideas were back on his home planet. It was time to change. Several months later, 5 elite swordsmen were waiting at Wingguang Peak. 2 of them were internal swordsmen, while the other 3 were external swordsmen. Lu Xiaoyi didn't know any of them, but judging from their breaths, he could tell that they were all in the late stage of foundation establishment, or even the peak of foundation establishment, except for him. They didn't need to go to Garan Temple in person. Instead, they were escorted by a Jingdan swordsman on a flying spiritual tool. It wasn't that they were afraid of the dangers on the way. In the western regions, swordsmen could travel freely even if they were in foundation establishment. The main reason was that they were afraid that they would cause trouble. This had happened before in the history of Xianyuan. Several swordsmen went to participate in a spiritual assembly, but in the end, they were nowhere to be seen. It turned out that they had caused trouble on the way and got into a fight with someone, thus delaying the journey. Guangnan, Yan Shu, Guangying, Yan Qi, and Yan Dun were the 5 participants. Among them, the first 2 were internal swordsmen. They were the backbone of the swordsman community in this period. None of them were on the ranking list. This was why Xianyuan was so generous. They never sent those who had proven themselves to participate in this kind of activity. Instead, they gave the opportunity to those who really needed it. Of course, it was the same for the other top sections. On the contrary, the small and medium-sized sects would send their strongest disciples to participate in this kind of activity. For them, there was no lack of glory. It was not a big trip. It had been held once every 30 years for tens of thousands of years. The only difference was that the reward this time was a little special. No one saw them off, nor did they say any heroic words. They just went to their neighbor's house to see if they could bring back some good stuff from their neighbor's house. Therefore, as soon as everyone arrived, they boarded the flying boat, took off, and left. Xuanyuan's dome was hundreds of thousands of miles away from Jielan's Oracle Lake. It would take at least several months to get there by flying in the Foundation establishment realm. However, if Marshal Uncle Jean Dan drove the flying boat, it would only take a dozen or so days to get there. It wouldn't affect their time on the way. No one spoke. Everyone was resting. Lu Xiaoyi was observing the sword spirits and surfing in his sea of consciousness. He was not idle at all. 2 years had passed, and the most powerful 4 seasons was close to passing the second stage. Hidden Fragrance was preparing to pass the first stage. Among the skills that Lu Xiaoyi had collected last time, the one he was most satisfied with was this Bo Lang slope. It really saved him a lot of time to raise his spirits. If he was still raising them as freely as before, the sword spirits would still be eating and waiting for death. Everyone had a tendency to be lazy, and so did the sword spirits. If you don't force yourself, you won't succeed. This time, among the 3 people from the Outer Realm, he was a plunderer from the Outer Realm. Guanying was a native of the 5th ring, and Yan Qi was from Xuanyuan's hometown, Qingkong. Balance was everywhere in every sect operation. It was also difficult for Gu Shan to make a balanced choice among the countless swordsmen in order to not provoke the resentment of those below. Unknowingly, Lu Xiaoyi found that he had become the representative of a faction, even though he had never participated in their scheming. He didn't know this at first, but it was Yan Qi who reminded him not to go overboard and pay attention to the unity of the factions. This old lady. They didn't speak a word along the way. When the 5th ring cultivators focused their energy on the void of the universe, the Jean Dan cultivators were the masters of this region, and it was difficult to meet anyone who didn't know better. Although they were both in the western regions, Garen's territory and Xuanyuan's territory were very different in terms of geography and environment. Xuanyuan's territory was higher and more dangerous, and had a smaller population. This was in line with the swordsman's orthodoxy. They were very reluctant to choose their territory in a rich land of fish and rice, because they felt that the population in such a place lacked a kind of tenacity. Garen, on the other hand, was the standard Dharma lineage ideology. They placed more emphasis on population and the people's livelihood. Garen's territory was mostly plains, and it was a rich land with a denser population. Oracle Lake was the brightest jewel of this plain. The lake spanned thousands of miles, and many palaces were built in the air. They relied on spirit designs to stay afloat. This required a huge amount of resources to support, but to Jiaolan, this was not a problem. Among the countless beautiful sights of Oracle Lake, there was a tall waterfall hanging in the air. Its structure was crude and majestic. It drew water from Oracle Lake through a formation, drawing it several hundred feet into the air before pouring it down. It was a spectacular sight to behold, toppling mountains and overturning seas. This was the scene of 100 vying barges. Uncle Master Gu Chuan was very familiar with the place, so he directly steered the flying boat to a large palace next to the waterfall. Many cultivators had already gathered here, and they came from all over the world. They were all outstanding cultivators from the western regions. Although they might not be considered the top, they could already be considered as elites. They were the backbone of the fifth ring foundation establishment stage. There were no houses to speak of here. The cultivators chose their own places, either on the eaves of the palace, on the roof, in the pavilions, or on the rippling waves of the lake. This was the true style of an immortal home. There were immortal buildings, and cultivators on the water. There was no need to worry about food, and no need to suffer from excretion. What was an immortal home? People became immortals by the mountains. This was the literal meaning. In fact, when a building didn't have a kitchen, a bedroom, a toilet, or a sewer, it could basically be considered an immortal home. Immortals were not human beings. Gu Chuan went to join the group, leaving the 5 sword cultivators behind to go their own way. They didn't group together, and the 5 of them went their own way. There was a reason for this, because they might be opponents in the 100 vying barges later. Now that they were friends, what would they do if they started fighting? Lu Xiaoyi had a rough idea of the process of 100 vying barges after comparing it with the jade slip given by Gu Chuan and the surrounding environment. The location was that huge waterfall. Based on his estimation, if a person went into the waterfall, they would have to endure at least a few thousand pounds of pressure. For high-level cultivators who had a deep understanding of the 5 elements, this might be no different from air. However, for foundation establishment cultivators who didn't know anything about the 5 elements, this was a pressure that they had to face carefully. Going through the waterfall was like carrying a small flowing mountain on one's shoulders. The waterfall was narrow at the top and wide at the bottom. This was natural. With a drop of several thousand feet, of course, the further one fell, the more scattered the waterfall would be. However, this also meant that the closer one was to the source of the waterfall, the greater the pressure one would have to endure. The rule of 100 vying barges was that 100 cultivators had to enter the waterfall from the bottom, and then go up the waterfall. During this time, they didn't have to fight with each other. As long as they didn't go out of the waterfall, they wouldn't be considered out of the competition. In the end, the first 3 cultivators to reach the top would be rewarded with the 6 items. The first place would get 3 items, the second place would get 2 items, and the third place would get 1 item. It was simple and clear. Chapter 344. The height of the waterfall was around 6 to 8 zhang. For a foundation establishment cultivator, this distance would only take a dozen or so breaths of time. However, that was referring to the sky and not going against the flow of the waterfall. Carrying a few thousand jin of water, the higher one went, the heavier it would become. According to the jade slip that Gu Chuan gave him, even if no one obstructed him, a cultivator of this height would need at least 1,000 breaths of time to reach the top of the waterfall. If there was someone causing trouble at the side, the time would be extended indefinitely. It was impossible for everyone not to drag you down. The people behind you would drag you down, and the people in front would suppress you. Not to mention others, just take a swordsman like him as an example. If a flying sword were to pierce you, would you accept it? If you didn't accept it, it would pierce a hole. If you accepted it, you would transfer your magic power to defense, and naturally, you wouldn't be able to withstand the impact of the waterfall. This was a test of a cultivator's overall strength. However, it had to be admitted that there was a high requirement for the level of cultivation. Lu Xiaoyi was lacking in this aspect. Swordsmen's strength lay in their explosive power, but even they couldn't explode for 1,000 breaths of time. If they couldn't, they would definitely explode into pieces. The 100 vying barges event was, in fact, only the finale of the entire event. Just this event alone, no matter how long it was delayed, wouldn't last more than an hour. Therefore, the 100 vying barges event was actually the last event. In the first dozen or so days, it was mainly a process for the cultivators to get to know each other. The disciples of the large sects needed to get to know each other, and they also needed to get to know some of their friends outside of the sect. In this journey of the fifth ring, it was very important to get to know each other when encountering disputes. In short, a sentence like "I'm very familiar with this person from your sect." This could reduce a lot of hostility, and it was possible for both sides to sit down and take a step back. Although the large sects of the fifth ring encouraged their disciples to participate in the competition, peace was still the main theme. This was something that would never change. Even the large sects were like this, not to mention the small and medium-sized forces. Of course, they were also willing to get to know some elites of the large sections. This was very important to them and their sections. As their cultivation levels got higher and higher in the future, this friendship might help them one day. Holding such an event in the western regions was beneficial to the stability and unity of the western regions. In fact, there were many similar events. Almost every sect that thought they had a certain amount of influence would invite other sects to participate every few decades. Lu Xiaoyi had always been too lazy to pay attention to the trends in this area, which was why he had not noticed it. In fact, every year, the ancient mountain temple of the Mingchuan Temple would send out different swordsman groups to participate in such events. Sometimes, they would be together with the inner swordsmen, and sometimes, when the standards were lower, they would be the outer swordsmen. Of course, there were those who made friends, and those who made enemies. This kind of thing was hard to explain. In the western regions there were 4 top sects: Xianyuan, Jialan, Spirit Gourd Cave, and Wanjing sect. Each of them only sent out 5 cultivators to participate, and the remaining spots were given to the small and medium-sized forces of the western regions. Although the overall strength of these forces could not compare, they had the advantage of numbers, and were a force to be reckoned with in the western regions. For example, the Righteous Law sect. Jialan was very Dafa. In fact, all the orthodox Taoist sects were very meticulous and orderly in their arrangements for the spiritual conference. The worst of them all was Xianyuan. This was a matter of style. There were explanations from different Jindan cultivators, and different levels of cultivators performing on the spot. They even provided some supplementary martial arts manuals for people to peruse. In their vast library, these manuals were just a drop in the ocean. Rather than letting them rot and mold, they might as well take them out to Dafa. Some martial arts manuals could not change a sect, they could only change a certain person. And the sudden rise of a certain person was never in the eyes of these top sections. Lu Xiaoyi really liked the explanations of the martial arts manuals in this spiritual conference, because the theme this time was power. Every 800 vying barges held by Jialan had its own theme. It could be the control of one's lifespan during the process of cultivation, or the various applications of mental energy in the lower levels of cultivators, or the things to take note of when building the foundation to break through to the Jindan. Slowly, 800 vying barges became the most famous small elite event in the western regions for building the foundation. Xianyuan actually had similar events in the past, but due to poor management, there was nothing to write home about. Eventually, the swordsmen could not stand it anymore and simply cancelled the event. It became a joke among the sects in the western regions. Every orthodoxy had its own strengths and strengths. No one could be good at everything. Since they were good at fighting, it was normal for them to be weak in other aspects. The understanding of power among the Taoists was slightly different from that of the swordsmen. The swordsmen only wanted to find ways to kill, while the Taoists were more concerned about Tao itself. If there had to be a winner, Lu Xiaoyi privately believed that the orthodox Taoists were still better. This was also reflected in their success rate. In terms of the number of high-level cultivators, not to mention the supreme 3 pure ones, even Jialan had more than Xianyuan. This was the result of their tireless pursuit of Tao. Therefore, he was very engrossed in the lecture. Not only him, but everyone else was also engrossed in it. This was Jialan's way of doing things. Unknowingly, he made the future seeds of these sects have a good impression of Jialan. Eventually, they would repay Jialan in the future. Every sect had its own way of surviving. Some were like Xianyuan, and some were like Jialan. There was no distinction between good and bad, but it was more in line with one's own style. He had gained a lot in the aspect of martial arts, and had supplemented some of his narrow-minded ideas about power. For example, his power of the stars was not necessarily useful in attacking. It could also be used in defense, in the starlight escape, in the absorption of spiritual opportunity, in the use of mental energy, and in many other aspects. There were almost no blind spots. He still needed to slowly explore these aspects in his future cultivation. Others could only provide him with a general direction, but he still needed to polish the details himself. After all, power was unique to him. However, his performance in making friends was not satisfactory. Making friends required a breakthrough. For example, if you made a friend, this friend would introduce you to his other friends, and then the circle of friends would expand. His problem was that he had been building his foundation for less than 30 years, so his circle was very narrow. In this aspect, he was far inferior to his other two external sword senior brothers. These two senior brothers were not in the mood to introduce him to their friends, which puzzled Lu Xiaoyi. Was it because he had entered the ranking list? Or was it because of other reasons? He was too lazy to know. Xianyuan had tens of thousands of external swords, so they could not be a single piece of iron. They were all brothers, so it was not easy to help each other in battle. It was unrealistic to ask for more. In the sword vein, there was a very famous chain of discrimination. Those from Qigong looked down on those from the fifth ring, thinking that they were the authentic origin of the sword vein. Those from the fifth ring looked down on those from the outer domain, thinking that they were country bumpkins and slave-type swordsmen. On the other hand, swordsmen from the outer domain looked down on those from Qigong. Everyone came from afar. We were not willing, but you were willing. You had no integrity at all. Why didn't you just stay in Qigong? Why did you have to come to the fifth ring to lick their boots? Chapter 345. There was another very important reason why he was affecting other people's interactions with him, and that was his cultivation level in the middle stage of the foundation establishment realm. This was very conspicuous among almost all the late-stage foundation establishment cultivators, and it was suspected that he had relied on his connections to come here. And this kind of cultivator who didn't rely on his own ability was the most despised by others. He wasn't the only one who didn't fit in with the crowd. There were a few others who were scattered outside the crowd. This was innate apathy, and it wasn't something that could be resolved just by pulling them to a lively place. On the night of the last day, Guchuan gathered them together and said a few important points. 100 vying barges is a competition of individual ability, not group strength. Therefore, there's no need to form groups during the competition. If everyone is like this, the winner of this event will never be able to escape from Xianyuan and Temple. This isn't the purpose of 100 vying barges. There are many eyes, and everyone is watching. Xianyuan has never won by numbers. Failure is a small matter, but losing integrity is a big matter. You must remember this. There's no need to have any misgivings. Xianyuan is good at killing decisively. If we lose this, we won't be able to win against Dharma cultivators. Temple has great cultivators secretly taking care of it, and there are very few accidental deaths in history. Therefore, it's better to be straightforward. Among the 100 people who came, there are 37 ranked cultivators, but most of them are at the bottom. I think you've known each other for more than 10 days. What I want to say here is that according to historical experience, among those who aren't ranked, there are often people who hide their strength. Don't be careless. Communication is also a kind of ability. You can know yourself and your enemy. If you're bored of being alone, then you need to have the ability to leave the world alone. Don't think that I'll introduce the abilities of other cultivators to you before the event. In the future, when you meet opponents in the 5 rings, who will introduce them to you one by one? The last sentence was directed at Lu Xiaoyi. What he meant was that his cultivation level was low to begin with, and he didn't get along with others. He didn't understand his opponents, and he didn't have the ability to pretend to be strong, but he was still pretending to be strong. This was a great taboo for cultivators. That was roughly what he meant, but Lu Xiaoyi was thick-skinned, so he didn't care at all. A cultivator's strength also depended on their ranking, but it also didn't depend on their ranking. For example, those who were ranked in the 6th, 7th, and 8th hundreds, their strength had already been exposed. Their greatest potential was only here for the time being. There was always an upper limit, just like Lu Xiaoyi's 99. There were also cultivators who were capable but kept a low profile. They didn't care about fame, but they might have taken a fancy to something powerful. Therefore, there must be such people mixed in. Furukawa's words implied that he was trying to teach Lu Xiaoyi a lesson. This was also his way of expressing his dissatisfaction. He felt that the external swordsman had chosen too casually, and he had given such a good opportunity to someone who wasn't strong enough. Even though he knew that Lu Xiaoyi had once been in the 999th place, such a result wasn't enough to be seen here. He didn't have any advantage at all. It was impossible for him to truly understand this external swordsman disciple. There were tens of thousands of external swordsmen, and he didn't have the time to do so. However, it could also be a clever way of trying to goad him. However, seeing that this disciple's mental state didn't fluctuate at all, Furukawa knew that what he had said was equivalent to not saying anything at all. His words had gone in one ear and out the other. The night passed silently. On the second day, everyone gathered in front of the waterfall. Jin Dan from Jialan was there to exhort everyone. Most of the exhortations were about friendship first and competition second. However, the real intention was the 6 items that were taken out later. A stone, a blade, a branch, a pearl, a feather, a bottle of water. Items that were powerful might not necessarily be magical tools or spiritual tools that were specially made by cultivators. Those that were made would be inferior in quality. Instead, some naturally formed or unnaturally formed items were more precious. For example, the feathers of a certain large bird that had been flying high in the sky with strong astral winds had naturally evolved into a wind force. Another example would be a powerful cultivator who had been meditating for a long time, and the surrounding environment resonated with him. Among them, a certain item had coincidentally been affected by the wind force. Naturally, that was the Great Tao. If it was done deliberately, it would be just like how a talisman was made into an assembly line product. How much meaning could there be in using it as a reference? A stone was a majestic aura. A blade was a bloody battle aura. A branch was a life aura. A feather was a drifting wind aura. A bottle of water was a gentle aura. As for a pearl, that was unknown. They were all very tempting items. When these 6 items were taken out, Lu Xiaoyi could feel the fighting spirit of the surrounding cultivators become much fiercer. This was the aura of group greed. The height of the waterfall was more than 6,000 feet. The magic formation drew water and poured down from the sky in the shape of a fan. The upper end was very narrow, and the lower end was extremely wide. When it reached the surface of the Oracle Lake, it was already several thousand feet wide. This was not completely a natural fall, but a magic formation that controlled it to disperse it. The original purpose of the design was to form a beautiful and spectacular Milky Way fountain, but it was not for cultivators to fight for victory. However, later on, cultivators found that it could be used, and thus the 100 vying barges. More than 100 people scattered under the waterfall, 1 person per dozen feet. Among them, the lone cultivators from the small and medium-sized sects were alone. They could not be considered as helpers. Only a few disciples from the top sects, such as Xianyuan, Jialan, Lingord Cave, and Wanjingliu, were aware of this. Under the watchful eyes of so many people, it was meaningless to join forces to kill their opponents. No one was stupid or blind. Lu Xiaoyi stood in the middle of the waterfall and felt the force of the water pressure. It was not as huge as he had imagined. It was probably only a few thousand pounds of impact force, which was very easy for a foundation establishment cultivator. However, he was very clear that this was because the water was dispersed. The higher he went, the heavier the pressure. It would not be as easy as it was now. He should wear something like a diving suit. Cultivators were not afraid of water. When the upstanding chi surged around their bodies, they could naturally not touch a drop of water. However, if they were in a fight, when their mana was not enough, they would naturally lose this layer of protection. It would be strange if they did not become a drowned rat. Of course, no one would wear a diving suit, and no one had the idea of wearing swimming trunks like Lu Xiaoyi. They were all cultivators, people with status. They were not pirates, so how could they be naked? They would not lose the demeanor of a cultivator. That was something more important than victory or defeat. With Jean Dan's command, the crowd of cultivators moved. That was not right, there were also some who did not move. Lu Xiaoyi did not move. He was a sly person. Considering that this was a long process, it did not matter whether he ran first or not. The key was that the scene was slightly crowded. If he followed the crowd now, he would use up his mana prematurely. He could not avoid using up his mana while going against the current. What he wanted was to save his mana for fighting. However, among the 100 cultivators, he was not the only one who was sly. The one on the left was leisurely, while the one on the right was smiling. Lu Xiaoyi was very depressed. Had he fallen into a chicken coop? Birds of a feather flocked together. It was not strange that the three of them had the same idea. What was strange was that they were standing together. Gu Chuan saw this from afar and could not help but shake his head. Just from the start, he could tell that this external sword did not have the qualities of a swordsman who did not fear difficulties. It was fine if he failed, but what was important was that he did not lose his sword heart. He did not know how the ranking board determined this person to be able to push this person up. Chapter 346. The three of them tacitly split up in the middle of the waterfall, increasing the distance between them. Their calculations were very precise. Moving horizontally at the bottom would save them a lot of effort compared to moving horizontally at the top. The higher they went, the greater the water pressure. It was like carrying a small mountain. As for the competition between the three of them, none of them were interested in it. This was determined by their personalities. Being one step behind the others meant that the three of them preferred to use their brains rather than their hands. Unless they had no other choice, they would not easily make a move. Lu Xiaoyi also noticed a similarity between them. The three of them were all in the middle stage of foundation establishment. They were also the only three among the 100 people present. This vaguely explained why the three of them could mix together. It was not a coincidence. After Lu Xiaoyi stood still, the other two took the initiative to move closer to him. Being together with a cultivator of the same level made them feel safer. Lu Xiaoyi finally started to move upstream. At this time, the majority of the crowd was already more than 100 feet above him. There were even some who were rushing even further. The two on his left and right were also more than 100 feet away. There was no need to pay attention to them. The key was that the fierce competition had already begun above him. This was an unavoidable situation. Because the surface of the waterfall was narrow at the top and wide at the bottom, most of the cultivators would be squeezed as they climbed up. Even if you did not want to fight, you would have to clear a safe space for yourself. Thus, collisions were unavoidable. A cultivator was falling right on top of his head. He was unlucky and was attacked from both sides at the same time, so he couldn't support himself and slid down. He even suffered some minor injuries. However, his bad luck wasn't over yet. Lu Xiaoyi didn't hesitate to add insult to injury and ruthlessly sprinkled a handful of salt on the cultivator's wound, directly knocking him out of the waterfall. Once a person was out of the waterfall, it meant that they had failed. They were not allowed to enter again. This was Lu Xiaoyi's philosophy. In the waterfall, the worst situation was to be attacked from both sides at the same time. There was no way to block it. The swordsman's sword could not be used at all. With a leap, he would be out of the waterfall. What was the point of fighting? He could not guarantee that the cultivators above and to his left and right would not attack him. However, he had to ensure that there was no one below him. Thus, as long as a cultivator fell within a certain range above him, he would increase his strength and send them out of the waterfall. It was very shameless, but this was the competition. There must be a suitable strategy. Ruthless. He was not the only one who was doing this. At least, the two fellows on his left and right were doing the same. If one's cultivation was low, one had to think of a way and not use brute force. In the first 1,000 feet, due to the weak water pressure, the speed of the cultivators was very fast. In less than 30 breaths, they had all crossed the line. However, there were still a dozen or so cultivators who were knocked out of the waterfall. This was the result of recklessness. There would always be people playing tricks on the side, and there was more than one. The cultivator at the front was already 300 feet ahead of him. His speed was astonishing. This was the result of using his profound mana to exert all his strength. It was also another strategy. The advantage of doing this was that at least no one was pressuring him from above. It was the same logic as Lu Xiaoyi's method of ensuring that no one below would hold him back. Strategies had to depend on the person. For Lu Xiaoyi, he couldn't be at the forefront, so he could only choose the one that was most suitable for him. When he got closer to the cultivator at the front, that cultivator felt the pursuers below and covered him with a water dragon. Lu Xiaoyi didn't take it head on. Instead, he took advantage of the situation and resolved it first. He was waiting for an opportunity. He was waiting for the opportunity for others to attack this cultivator. Then, he would hit him when he was down. Such an opportunity was inevitable. That cultivator didn't have time to continue pressuring him before he was attacked from the left. The cross-section was getting narrower and narrower. There were people all around. No one could say for sure where the next wave of attacks would come from. Lu Xiaoyi didn't know either. What he wanted to do was to take advantage of others' difficulties. 2,000 feet, 3,000 feet. The water pressure increased. It had already exceeded 5,000 caddies. The cultivator started to have difficulty moving. This could be seen from the fact that the cultivator at the front couldn't increase the distance between him and Lu Xiaoyi after 500 feet. This was Lu Xiaoyi's goal. What's the use of running fast? It's fine as long as you don't run out of the range of my flying sword. I'll drag you down at the end. The competition became more and more intense. Nearly half of the cultivators had been forced out. This was a critical point. Those who weren't strong enough, those who weren't smart enough, those who didn't use the right tactics, or those who were unlucky, had already been eliminated. The remaining cultivators were all experts, and the most cunning ones. Among the 5 cultivators from Xianyuan, 2 had already been eliminated. Guanying and Yanqi were external swords. This was in line with the position of Xuanyuan's external swords in the cultivation world of the 5-ring continent. Their strength was stronger than the average cultivator, but they were weaker than the elites of the top sections. They might not be comparable to the few elites of the small and medium-sized sects, so it was reasonable for them to be eliminated. The only thing that surprised Gu Chuan was that the wretched and despicable cigarette, but who didn't have a sword heart, was still swimming in the crowd. Moreover, from the battle results, this brat had schemed against others the most. There was more than one such bastard. There were 3 mid-stage Foundation establishment cultivators hanging at the tail of the group. Their ranking would never change. They were at the tail of the group. The only change was that there were fewer and fewer people above them, and the tail was getting shorter and shorter. Their goal was to nibble away. Once the people above them were cleaned up, they would be in the top 3. Of course, you could also say that they were still in the bottom 3. A golden Dan from Sangarama watched with great interest. What a good strategy! You have to use your brain when you cultivate. It's a pity that there aren't any disciples from temple here. The children are still too upright. Junior brother Gu Chuan, your Xuanyuan's disciples are still the best. There are a lot of talents. Not only are there those who rely on their strength, there are also those who take the risk of scheming against others. Very comprehensive. Have all the bastards in the western regions been cleaned up by you? This Jean Dan from temple was implying something. Among the last 3 bastards, the other 2 were the elites of the small sections. Lu Xiui was the only one from the large sections. In theory, under the education system of the prestigious and upright sects, such disgraceful behavior would not occur. The top sects all cared about their reputation. His words resonated with the 2 Jin Dan beside him. They were Jin Dan from Spirit Gourd Cave and Wan Jinglu. Seeing their own disciples being constantly schemed against like this, they were dissatisfied in their hearts. This was a very strange thought. If these 3 people were all disciples of small and medium-sized sects, they would not have any objections. Afterwards, they would even warn their own disciples that they needed to be more flexible when traveling outside. This could also be considered a lesson. However, Xian Yuan also had such a person, which made them very angry. Based on what? Everyone was above board, but Xian Yuan used the name of a large sect to play dirty? Jin Dan from Wan Jinglu echoed. It's not necessarily because they took in all the bastards. It's also possible that they entered the sect and taught them. Gu Chuan snorted coldly. Above board? Above board? Then let's first set the realm of all the cultivators at the middle stage of the foundation establishment realm. I think you guys are just sour grapes. Your own disciples are all taught like idiots, yet you're blaming my Xuanyuan's disciples for being smart and resourceful? Chapter 347. After reaching 4,000 zhang, Lu Xiaoyi discovered that his sneak attacks were starting to become more difficult. Nobody was blind. When the tide receded, the 3 sneaky cultivators were exposed. At this time, if he wanted to sneak attack when the opponent was unprepared, it would be very easy for the opponent to see through him. When Lu Xiaoyi launched another sneak attack, the higher-level cultivators would not attack the person closest to them, but the lower-level cultivators. Their actions finally aroused the hatred of everyone. Lu Xiaoyi took a deep breath, silently accumulating his strength. His cultivation was not enough to support him from the start, but it could support him in the last 100 zhang. It was also the most difficult part of the eruption. He did not need to worry about whether he had enough time. Although it was only 100 zhang, the time used by the cultivators in the last 100 zhang accounted for almost 30% of the total time. Because of the abnormally heavy water pressure, everyone found it difficult to even move. Everything before was only to ensure that he did not fall too far behind in the early stages of the competition, and to maintain the minimum consumption and expenditure. He had never thought that he could rely on sneaking all the way to the peak. That was unrealistic, and he would be looking down on the heroes of the world. In this last 100 zhang, he could only compete with real guns and bullets. When he decided on a target, he did not consider anything else. Probing, forcing, flying, forcing, all these were not within his consideration. Directly deciding life and death. If Jiao Lan Jin Dan wanted to save him, then save him. If he couldn't save him, then he deserved to die. This was within the rules. If not, with his current strength, he would not be the first to reach the peak. He did not have the strength to subdue others without a fight. Just his aura alone was enough to make others feel fear. He wanted to help his friend obtain a few items to repay his friend's kindness. There were many who had the same idea. So in the distance of 4,000 zhang to 5,000 zhang, the atmosphere became strangely quiet. Only a few cultivators were sent flying, while the rest were silently accumulating strength. This caused Lu Xiaoyi's spirit to gradually become excited. He was a little timid, a little overcautious, and a little indecisive. However, when he really decided to do something, the madness in the depths of his soul would make him a little unable to control himself. It was precisely because of this that he suppressed himself, and wanted to be a careful person. Even though he had persevered for so many years, when things came to a head, that madness would still find him. Thus, he understood that his efforts over the years had not worn away that madness, but had only hidden it deeper. Aluo's first place is secured! A difference of several tens of feet will not cause any accidents in the last few hundred feet. Jean Dan of the Spirit Gourd Cave said happily. Aluo was a disciple of Sangha, but his parents were upper cultivators of the Spirit Gourd Cave. He was a typical cultivator of the Spirit Gourd Cave, and was the leader of 2 sections. This kind of situation usually happened between 2 sects that had a close relationship, and was much more reliable than a marriage alliance. Jiaolan Jin Dan replied. Chimu and Fido are also not bad, they are in the first echelon. They are the strongest competitors among the last 3 winners. I think one of them will definitely be in the top 3. Jin Dan of the Wan Jinglu said sourly. Well, your Sangha and the Spirit Gourd Cave have taken the top 3. Everyone is happy, we should not let the goodies flow into the fields of others. But I don't know what you think of our leader in the western regions? The Foundation Establishment cultivators of the Wan Jinglu did not perform well in the 800 vying barges competition. First, they did not expect that the strength of the participating cultivators was generally stronger than that of the previous competitions. Second, the Wan Jinglu cultivators' performance in the medium of the water was greatly affected. Perhaps it would not matter when they reached a higher level, but they were still in the Foundation Establishment stage now. The Tao of scenery was easily affected by the environment, especially when they were in the middle of a waterfall. Others would be affected by the water when they were casting spells, but the Wan Jinglu cultivators had to maintain their Tao of scenery in the normal state, so the consumption of magic power was particularly large. 3 of the 5,000 View sect cultivators had been chased out. The remaining 2 were also struggling bitterly. They were in an awkward position and didn't have much hope. That was why the Golden Core cultivator directed the spearhead to Xianyuan. On the 5 ring continents there were many sects and forces. The top sects had an unshakable dominance, which came from their strength. However, this strength was more of an absolute advantage in overall strength. In terms of individual cultivators, the big sects had more elite disciples, but the small and medium-sized sects had more outstanding disciples. Therefore, in the 800 vying barges competition, it was not strange for the small and medium-sized sect's disciples to kill and win. But this time, the performance of the big sect's disciples was more stable. Xianyuan was in the first echelon, and there were 2 inner swordsmen. They were at the same level as the Chimu and Fido mentioned by Jiaolan. In the same position, there were several small and medium-sized sect's disciples. There were too many things to consider, so it was impossible to judge who would stand out in the end. All one could say was that all of them had a chance. The winner is still unknown. Isn't it too presumptuous to predict that Aluo will win? Furukawa said coldly. Swordsman was good at explosiveness. Although Aluo was in the lead, it was not like there was no way to win. If the 2 inner swordsmen could cooperate. However, 800 vying barges did not encourage a group attack. Therefore, although the chances were slim, he could not be soft. The basis of their judgment was the effective range of the techniques and sword techniques in the waterfall. If it was in the air, this distance was nothing. It was just a matter of a flying sword and a technique, and the attacking and defending positions would change instantly. However, in the water, it was different. For example, flying swords were a form of control in the void of the universe. In the atmosphere, there was air resistance, so it was different. In the water, the difference was like heaven and earth. If it drilled into the ground, it would not be able to fly more than 10 feet away. This had a lot to do with the medium of the environment. It was the same for techniques. Under the erosion of the waterfall, fire, earth, wind, and light elements could not be used. If you were a cultivator who specialized in fire, half of your abilities would be crippled. The other elements were also very difficult to use. Only water and ice elements were like tigers that had grown wings. Of course, this kind of awkwardness only happened to Foundation Establishment cultivators. They were ignorant of the fundamental principles of the 5 elements, and did not have the strength to understand them. In this kind of situation, Aluo's lead of 10 feet was very crucial. This was because most people could not affect him at all. Even the inner swordsmen's flying swords would find it difficult to maintain their power after 10 feet in the water. They would only be able to scratch an itch. This was the reason why they thought Alul was certain to win. Now, the key was the other two positions. There were less than 10 people fighting for them. This was the main focus of the next competition. Treasures of power were very precious in the fifth ring. Even Dafa like Jialan took it out as a reward. In fact, he also hoped that his disciple would benefit in the end. This was different from the previous competitions. This was also the reason why they sent out their true experts. Take Alul for example. He was a Loki person, and he had 2 elements. He was definitely in the top 300. It was just that he did not show it in front of others. Now that he had used it, no one could say that Jialan had sent a ranked expert to protect him. Everyone knew this was a trick. Chapter 348. Jean Dan of Jialan smiled and stroked his beard. A little bet for fun. I'd bet 100 spirit jades that the first place will be Alul, and the other 2 will be Chimu and Faidu. Jean Dan of Spirit Gourd Cave chimed in. I'm different from you. The first place will be Alul, and the other 2 will be a disciple of Spirit Gourd Cave and a swordsman of Xianyuan. He was very modest and knew how to save face for the leader of the western regions. However, Gu Chuan didn't like his hypocritical behavior. When he opened his mouth, he was as straightforward as Xianyuan. The first place will be Alul, and the other 2 can only be my inner swords. When it was Jean Dan of Wan Jingliu's turn, he was very embarrassed because none of the cultivators in front of him were from Wan Jinglu. Without his own cultivators, how could he bet? He couldn't hold his head high for others. He might as well smash the pot. I'll bet on the side door. I'll bet that those 3 wretched guys will succeed in their counterattack. If I win, you'll have to pay me back double. Lu Xiaoyi felt the pressure on his body for the last time. It was close to 10,000 pounds. Normal escape techniques couldn't help him catch up with the others. If he wanted to offset all of this, he had to land on the momentum. If he merged the momentum of the stars into his escape technique, he couldn't increase his speed, but he could break through the barrier. Simply put, he was a car that was moving at 100 miles per hour before, and he was still moving at 100 miles per hour now. However, with momentum, he was a tank that was moving at 100 miles per hour. The only use was that he could ignore the impact of the water to a certain extent. Because he had only comprehended it for a short time, the momentum of the stars wasn't complete yet. However, it was enough to deal with the environment here. When the height reached 500 feet, the situation changed immediately when there was only 18 to 18 feet left to reach the top. Lu Xiaoyi wasn't the only one who understood that this was their last chance. Almost everyone here understood. All kinds of short-distance teleportation techniques were used. The lights of spells flashed frequently, and the whole group of cultivators was in chaos. In the waterfall, the teleportation distance was also greatly limited. Usually, they could teleport hundreds of meters away, but now, they could only teleport hundreds of meters away. At their level, who didn't have 1 or 2 methods to instantly increase their speed. The only difference was whether they would teleport first or plan before taking action. Amidst such chaos, the order of the scene was in disarray. This was because many unfamiliar faces had appeared in the surrounding area, and they were vying for a higher position in the increasingly crowded space. It was no longer up to you to choose your opponent. Instead, you could only attack those who passed by you. At the same time, you would also be baptized by the spells of other cultivators. They could only rely on their instincts to fight, and they couldn't tell who their opponents were. The waterfall, which had quieted down a moment ago, suddenly burst out like a pot of boiling water. Water dragons, water tornadoes, water whirlpools, water walls, and so on. Countless water-type spells burst out on the upper section of the waterfall that was getting narrower and narrower, as if a shoal of fish were jumping desperately when a fisherman was pulling in the net. No one used the ice element because it took too much time. It was a bit of a stretch for foundation establishment. After some fish jumped out, they couldn't go back. Chaos was the biggest characteristic of the current situation. In such chaos, three figures began to jump up, each with their own unique skills. Lu Xiaoyi borrowed the power of the stars, and his speed was faster than normal, but slower than teleportation. However, he won in terms of endurance. The other two figures were the Foundation establishment cultivators who had once stolen chickens with him. Their strategy was exactly the same as Lu Xiaoyi's. This was the inevitable choice of cultivators who had been tested in battles. There was no such thing as a brilliant strategy that Lu Xiaoyi could think of that others couldn't. One of them used the tide to go against the flow, which was exactly the environment under the waterfall. The other used the Taoist body secret technique to transform into a human and go against the flow. A cultivator in the middle stage of Foundation establishment participating in an activity where most of the cultivators in the late stage of Foundation establishment were in the middle stage was either stupid or had other plans. Were there any cultivators stupid? Zhu Qing opened the path, the Four Seasons spear, the Big Dipper and the Divine Shadow circled the left and right. 4 flying swords were released. Among the external swords, they didn't count for much, but among them, there were truly 2 vicious swords. Zhu Qing and the Four Seasons spear were both powerful flying swords with all kinds of bonuses. The Sword Spirits bonus, the Sword Formations bonus, the Power of the Stars bonus, the 37 Imbalance bonus. Up until now, the penetrative power of the flying swords was already several times that of an ordinary external swordsman. In the Foundation establishment realm, they were abnormal existences. All defenses set up based on the power of ordinary external swords were instantly broken by these 2 flying swords. Breaking through meant injury, and injury meant death. If you didn't leave the waterfall, you would have to leave your life here. In such a choice, how many strong points were there? The specific environment of the waterfall determined that the cultivators had very little room for choice. It was very difficult for them to be like outside, where they could move around, concentrate on setting up defenses, and fight steadily and surely. Here, there were too many opponents. One simply couldn't determine who was more threatening and which flying sword was more powerful. Only by attacking and defending could one know. And as long as one fought against Lu Xiaoyi, the only result was elimination. The main reason was that his sword was too heavy. He had to withstand the impact of the water and defend against the attacks of other cultivators. He couldn't focus on one sword, so he was like a hot knife through butter. There were also people who fought against Lu Xiaoyi. He chose to fight head-on. At this time, the difference between water-type spells and flying swords was obvious. Water-type spells couldn't kill people quickly, but flying swords could. At the same time, Lu Xiaoyi's flying swords were faster and fiercer. When he was hit by the other cultivators' water-type spells, it was often when the other cultivators had already been hit by the flying swords. The spell's effects would then dissipate, and after his damage reduction and physical strength resistance, only a slight injury would be left. In terms of tactics, this kind of head-on charge didn't require much skill. It might not be advisable in an open space, but it was the most suitable in the waterfall. Because the opponent didn't have time to react by the time they adjusted their defensive posture, Lu Xiaoyi would have already passed them. The 3 of them were like 3 sharp arrows, shooting into the chaos and creating even more chaos. Even more people were injured and eliminated. Among them, there were even a few who were seriously injured. They were so busy that the Jing Dan outside flew up. The 3 tiger cubs bared their fangs at the last moment. In order to pass through the passage, Lu Xiaoyi had to pass through more than 10 checkpoints. The other 2 were the same. But this wasn't absolute, because these checkpoints were also competing with each other. The cultivator who transformed into a human encountered the smoke tree of Xianyuan. In the cultivation world, there was an unwritten saying that swordsmen subdued magic cultivators subdued body cultivators, and body cultivators subdued swordsmen. This wasn't absolute. But in a sense, body cultivators did have some advantages over swordsmen. For example, their skin was thick and they didn't care about the damage of ordinary flying swords. If you couldn't kill them in one blow, body cultivators could always recover. Swordsmen had no advantage in close combat. In the waterfall, this weakness was infinitely magnified, because swordsmen had lost their most reliable mobility. They had no choice but to fight in a narrow space. This young body cultivator was very brave. He braved the flying swords of the smoke tree and charged forward. He didn't care that his body was pierced into a sieve and punched the smoke tree out of the waterfall. In the foundation establishment stage, the weakness of the inner sword's single flying sword was exposed. For magic cultivators, their bodies wouldn't be able to withstand such a blow, but top body cultivators could. Especially this young body cultivator, who had a unique body. Chapter 349. The fight in the middle was even more intense. Not only was Lu Xiaoyi hot on their heels, but the fight between the three cultivators above them had reached a critical point. Guangnan, Qimu, and Fida. The three of them had been fighting separately. The orthodoxy of the spiritual gourd cave was known for its righteousness and integrity. The cultivators of the spiritual gourd cave tended to be righteous and upright. Therefore, the two of them had never joined forces in the fight between the cultivators. However, even the most righteous cultivators had their own selfish motives. They couldn't show it when there were too many people, but when there were only three of them left, the choice was inevitable. How could the three of them fight? No matter how righteous the cultivators of the spiritual gourd cave were, they wouldn't fight with each other and then let the winner deal with the Xianyuan swordsman. This didn't conform to the actual situation. However, since it was a chaotic fight, there would naturally be differences. One side was the Xianyuan swordsman, and the other side was his fellow disciple. There was no need to consider which side was more important. Now that the situation had developed to this point, there was no need to work together. This was forced by the situation. The pitiful Guangnan's true strength was slightly stronger than the two of them, but in such a stifling environment, coupled with the heavy pressure from the two magic cultivators, he was ultimately defeated. Under the two's overwhelming water attacks, he spat out a mouthful of blood. He persevered. Unfortunately, the swordsman shouldn't be a orthodoxy that stood firm. However, his flying sword couldn't break through the defense of the two cultivators in a short time. This should have been achieved through movement and tactical use. They defeated one swordsman, but in the end, another swordsman came immediately. Fida was the senior brother. He felt that he had an obligation to buy time for his junior brother. The one who came was just an external sword, far inferior to Guangnan. There was no need for the two of them to fight. It would be too embarrassing. A waterspout with countless water arrows was Fida's specialty in the waterfall. It was a perfect combination. His casting speed was fast, and they were in a water environment. He was confident that he could turn the external sword into a hedgehog before the flying sword hit him. The flying sword came very fast, but Fida still didn't change his strategy. Just in case, he covered himself with a vine shield. He was curious as to how the external sword could run so fast. Where did the other cultivators go? It wasn't that his perception wasn't sharp enough, but that the situation was too chaotic. There were dozens of cultivators below him, and he was constantly facing challenges. The Xianyuan swordsmen from small and medium-sized sex-top cultivators. They didn't notice how a cultivator at the end of the line suddenly rose to the top swordsman. The waterspout went down with the flow of the river, and its speed was faster. The flying sword went against the flow of the river, and there was some obstruction. The result was that the attacks from both sides arrived at almost the same time. Lu was turned into a hedgehog swordsman. However, Fidu was also pierced like a sugar-coated hawthorn. The power of the waterspout dissipated because it lost the support of the cultivators, but Ju's city was still standing strong. Fidu wanted to fight again, but he was pulled out by Jean Dan from the spiritual gourd cave. Jean Dan knew that if Fidu didn't treat him immediately, he wouldn't live to see the next day. Although Chimu was very close to his brother, he was now very close to the sword cultivator. Although he did not understand how the sword cultivator could escape so quickly with the cultivation of the middle stage of the foundation establishment realm, it did not stop him from bravely turning around to face him. He would rather not have the reward than show his back to his opponent. With a shake of his hand, a long sword appeared in his hand. He was about to fight hand to hand. Lu Xiaoyi's posture was strange. He moved in a slanted arc, holding the long sword in his right hand. His face looked a little ferocious because of the water arrows just now. Just as they were about to collide, someone made a move first. Jin Dan, who was holding Fido in one hand, waved his hand again and pulled Chimu out. Just as he was involuntarily taken away, an arc of light suddenly shot up from below his body. The extremely powerful sword she caused a layer of goosebumps to appear on his skin. Jin Dan had sharp eyes. How could a man who occasionally played with a sword compare with a man who had been wielding a sword for decades? This was not a wound caused by a spell, nor was it a wound caused by a flying sword. It was the result of being cut in half. There was no saving him. Lu Xiaoyi's front suddenly opened up. There was a figure about 100 feet away, who was still moving forward firmly. He was only 100 feet away from the top. Even if he borrowed the power of the celestial escape, he couldn't catch up with him. There was nothing he could do. Even if he knew that the flying sword might not be effective in a long-distance attack, he could only release the Four Seasons to try to stop him. He was still too far away. Even if his opponent couldn't block the flying sword, he could still dodge it by moving sideways. Almost at the same time, the young body cultivator also stood out. When he saw the figure in the distance, he didn't hesitate. He opened his mouth and exhaled. A natal original shadow flew up like lightning, ignoring the waterfall. On the other side, the third cultivator in the middle stage of foundation establishment came out. He also targeted Luo, who was the closest to the top. He raised his hand and a bow appeared in his hand. He released the string and a wave of light flashed. In the flash, Li Long bared its fangs and brandished its claws, opening its huge mouth. Luo's strategy of 100 vying barges this time was absolutely correct. Many people could think of accelerating at the start, but he was the only one who could accelerate to such a degree. As someone who had mastered the systems of two top sects, he was naturally intelligent and diligent. It wasn't surprising that he could figure out something different on his own. Other than the few times he was attacked during the chaos at the start, he didn't get attacked again from 1,000 feet away. It wasn't that everyone liked him, but that this kind of attack was becoming more and more meaningless. Because he had increased the distance, he actually had the ability to dodge sideways. At least, he wouldn't lose the lead because of dodging. His advantage in the beginning was so great that he could do things that the cultivators behind him didn't dare to do. This was the advantage of leaving others in the dust. Fewer and fewer people attacked him. Instead, they focused on the threats around them and tacitly agreed that he was the first. Therefore, the magical power he lost along the way was just the magical power he used to withstand the pressure of the water. There was a lot of noise below, and it was hard to distinguish the specific situation. It was vaguely a competition between a few big sections. Apart from the Wan Jinglu, the 100 vying barges activity wasn't very friendly to the orthodoxy of the Wan Jinglu. Everyone knew this. Now, he found that the people below had changed again. It seemed to be a fundamental change. The Sangharama cultivator was the first to be eliminated. Half of it was because of his strength, and the other half was because of the considerations of cultivation. With Luo in first place, if other Sangharama cultivators rushed into the top 3, they would be criticized. Therefore, it was agreed that if he went well, the other Sangharama cultivators would quietly give up at the end and let a few elites from small and medium-sized sects come up. The Sangharama cultivator's elimination was expected, but the Xianyuan swordsman's elimination was somewhat unexpected. What surprised him even more was the Sangharama cultivator's elimination at the end. The order was completely different. It happened in an instant, so fast that no one could react. Alua was very surprised, but that was all. It had nothing to do with him. There was no surprise in his first place. This was confidence. Chapter 350. Alua was only a few dozen meters away from the top. This couldn't even be called a short distance. It was just a matter of moving his butt. This was the shortest distance in 100 vying barges, but it was also the longest. He never thought that there would be a day when things would be so awkward that he couldn't even walk the last few dozen meters. The 3 attacks represented 3 unyielding spirits. After scheming, struggling, and exploding, they finally revealed their daggers and bared their sharp fangs. They regarded each other as nothing. In their eyes, there was only first place, nothing else. In Aluo's eyes, he had his own judgment of the danger level of the 3 attacks. The body cultivator's natal shadow was the most important, followed by the dragonfly, and the one he looked down on the most was the ordinary flying sword. This might be a bit rushed, but he didn't have time to think about it carefully. The 3 attacks were automatic and controlled by his spirit, so dodging wasn't a good idea. Charging with his back to the top wasn't a good idea either, because he was destined to not be able to outrun these 3 attacks. The only thing he was sure of was that the 3 of them couldn't reach him for the time being, so he had a chance to seriously block these 3 waves of attacks and then turn around. His hands waved, and a spiritual force unfolded in front of him, quickly revealing its original form. It was a green gourd. This was the ability he'd obtained from the spirit gourd cave, the energy-controlling gourd. The natal shadow of a body cultivator couldn't be dissolved by ordinary defensive methods. It was something that was both real and illusory. It wasn't something that could be stopped by the power of the 5 elements. In other words, only those who understood the true essence of the 5 elements could resist it, and not now. The energy-controlling gourd could swallow all non-elemental spiritual objects. It was especially good at dealing with body cultivators' natal magical abilities. The gourd itself was constructed from spiritual energy. Faced with the natal apparition that ignored the waterfall, the gourd sucked in a breath and sucked the natal apparition into the gourd's stomach. In an instant, the power of the natal apparition and the power of the gourd both exploded in a contest, turning into a powerful spiritual shockwave that evaporated a large area of the waterfall. Mutual destruction. But could his gourd condense again? Could the body cultivator's natal shadow be condensed again in a short period of time? Like moving clouds and flowing water, Aluo continued to cast spells in this short period of time. He wasn't worried about whether the energy-controlling gourd could block the body cultivator's crazy attack. This was his confidence and pride. So what if he was a rising star? So what if he was a genius that only appeared once in 100 years? Compared to the tens of thousands of years of inheritance of the 2 top sects, what was this? After the gourd, hordes of leeches began to appear in the waterfall. Thousands upon thousands of them swarmed over. Just like the seeping dragon, they were all favored by water. However, when they attached themselves to the seeping dragon, the huge and ferocious seeping dragon was helpless against these tiny spiritual creatures of the same species. Under the sucking of the spirit leech, the strong and vigorous body of the dragonet was like a deflated toy. It turned from a fat man to a thin man, and from a thin man to a skeleton. At the same time, the tens of thousands of spirit leeches swelled 10 times. They were like small spirit balls that could be broken with a single blow. The spirit leech and Sangharama's spirit husbandry technique were extremely effective against the mimicry techniques of the water element. No matter what you mimicked, whether it was a dragon, a snake, a turtle, or a shark, under the suction of these little things, it was just a plate of food. To be able to find the correct countermeasure in an instant, and use it reasonably, one could see the depth of a cultivator's spells from this. The fact that he was able to stay in the lead position all this time showed that he was worthy of his name. On the contrary, Aluo was hesitant about the last material flying sword. The simplest might also be the most complicated. He had already realized that among the 3 people below, the sword cultivator in the middle faced the greatest resistance when it came to breaking through. Even the 7 shepherds' flying cross was destroyed by his hands. How could this flying sword be simple? Against the seeping dragon and spirit shadow, he had defensive measures in his arsenal. Against the most common physical attack of the flying sword, how could he not have a countermeasure? The problem was that there were too many countermeasures. He didn't know which one to choose. He had already vaguely felt that the flying sword was extremely dangerous. Against the simplest physical attack, he had 100 spells to choose from, but he couldn't feel at ease using any of them. When the attack power exceeded a certain limit, almost all defensive measures would lose their effect. He didn't have time to think too much. The seeping dragon was a water element, and the spirit shadow was a type of spiritual force. They could ignore the water flow and come faster. The flying sword was a material object, so it was slower. But no matter how slow it was only a few millimeters away from him. How much time and space could it give him? The muddy gold shield, the sunken wood plate, the water whirlpool, the ice wall. He laid out the toughest defense in front of him. This wasn't his best state. Because he had to resist the water flow, he was temporarily weakened after using 2 of his special techniques. But he still didn't think that anything could penetrate his defense. But the fact was, the penetration happened just like that. It was as if he didn't set up a defensive spell, but layers of window paper. He blocked the highest level spirit shadow and defended against the reverse beast form. But he couldn't defend against the simplest flying sword. Sharpness. Other than sharpness, it was sharpness. There was nothing else. The swordsman put all his strength into what he was best at. There were no tricks, no changes, just simple sharpness. It broke through all of his defenses, pierced into his body, and even penetrated through. There was no need for too many tricks. One move to break through a country. Lu Xiaoyi had been practicing the sword for dozens of years. Almost all of his energy was focused on how to make the sword sharper. Even if you have thousands of changes, let me ask you one thing. Can you block this sword? This time, it was Jialan Jin Dan. He waved his hand from outside, and the heavily injured Aluo was pulled out. He really couldn't judge. When the swordsman came over, if Aluo subconsciously blocked, would he be cut in half? The 3 silhouettes rushed upwards. At this moment, the surroundings were quiet. There was no one above or below. Only the 3 of them were left to rearrange their seats. Lu Xiaoyi waved his hand, and the 4 flying swords gathered in front of him. He didn't make a move, and just flew up. Because his magic power had dried up, if he looked for someone to fight, whether he could win or not aside, he was afraid that he would first be washed down by the strong water flow. He would only have the remaining magic power to maintain the star force escape. In his current situation, he could only look at the other 2. There was nothing he could do. However, they were all in the middle stage of foundation establishment. If his magic power had dried up, how good would the other 2 be? The body cultivator's natal avatar couldn't appear anymore. Even his other divine abilities couldn't be used. It was the same for the spell cultivator. He only focused on sprinting and didn't care about anything else. The last few hundred feet had become a pure competition between the 3 exhausted people. They were competing with the last of their magic power. Lu Xiaoyi didn't have the most magic power left, but his star force escape relied on the flow of the water. He had the advantage of speed. In the end, he stretched his neck and weighed his feet, allowing him to take first place. The body cultivator was very unconvinced. If the waterfall had been 10 feet higher, he might have taken first place. The spell cultivator was third. He had dropped another body. He was like a lamp that had run out of fuel. There was nothing to say. Chapter 351. The curtain of 100 vying barges fell. Jin Dan of Wan Jinglu sighed. I won! He didn't have anything to be happy about. The bet wasn't important. What was important was the potential talent. If he could exchange, he would rather use the same amount of spirit jades to exchange for the name of a Wan Jinglu disciple. Jin Dan of Spirit Gourd Cave was dissatisfied. Fida's injuries were severe, so he could only stay at temple to heal. If Chimu hadn't reacted quickly, he might have been split in half. Fellow Taoist Gu Chuan, Xuanyuan's disciples are too ruthless. Is this necessary for an exchange? Gu Chuan laughed. Not ruthless? Are you still a swordsman if you're not ruthless? He was in high spirits. Since you called Xianyuan here, you should have been mentally prepared for this. Didn't you want to use this to familiarize yourselves with Xuanyuan's ruthlessness? What? You're starting to talk about other things now that I've shown you? When everyone gathered in front of the hall again, there were less than 100 people left. Many of them needed to be treated at temple, including a Xianyuan swordsman, Jian Guingnan. He had been tormented by the 2 Spirit Gourd Cave cultivators. There were still 70 to 80 people left at the scene, waiting for the most exciting moment. Sangarama Jindan had already returned to normal. To be honest, such an ending was also very reasonable. The 3 Foundation establishment tiger cubs had come together and turned 100 vying barges upside down. In fact, it was in accordance with the principles of the heavenly Tao. The only regret was that none of the 3 cultivators who stood out were their disciples. However, this also taught them a vivid lesson. Nothing could be obtained easily for free. This year's 100 vying barges would leave its name in history as a counterattack. Lu Shi was the first to walk up the stage. He was cultured and refined, and even a little shy. There were too many people watching from below, so he felt a little embarrassed. Jin Dan sighed. How could such a sunny young man be so ruthless when he acted? Was it his nature, or was it the influence of Xuanyuan's environment? What kind of conditions would it take to turn the disciples of Garan Temple into a flower when they smiled, and a mouth full of fangs when they turned hostile? There are 6 items here. According to the rules, as the one who reached the top, you have the right to choose 3 of them. However, I cannot tell you their specific locations in advance. Do you understand? Lu Xiaoyi was very polite. His smile was as bright as the sun, and his mouth was as sweet as honey. Xiaolan's generosity is a role model for the cultivators of the 5th Ring sector. It was the pillar of stability for the continent, the beacon of light for Taoism. Although it was Little Yi's first time here, he felt that this place was like his second home. It was inexplicably intimate, and he yearned for it. He wished that he could stay here for a long time, cultivate his mind, and cleanse the stench on his body. Senior, please give me some pointers later. I want to see Senior Brother Aluo. At that time, I had no choice but to be obsessed. For a mere benefit, I actually disregarded the friendship between our 2 clans. I am truly ashamed. Jin Dan was getting impatient. Who are you trying to fool? Do you still consider Garan as your second home? Who has ever seen someone use a sword to cut down their own clansmen? 1 stone, 1 branch, 1 water, 1 bead, 1 saber, 1 feather. Please choose carefully. Once you choose, you will not change anything. Although that was what he said, it was easy to guess what kind of power these items represented, except for that bead. He had come here to obtain power for his friend. Although his 2 friends had never told him what kind of power they liked, after spending 5 years together in the Wolf Ridge, he had a rough idea of the general situation. The towering stone, the softness of water, and the life of a branch were not his friend's powers. After spending so many years together, he had never seen any towering tendency in Yen Bo, nor did he see any softness in Yen Bo. In his opinion, for Yen Bo, who liked to pretend to be soft, the power of the wind was exactly what he liked. Yen Bo was a girl, but to his senior sister, who loved to fight, there was nothing more suited to her than the power of a bloody battle. As for himself, since he had no preference, he might as well choose that so-called bead and gamble on his luck. With a wave of his hand, a feather, a saber, and a bead fell into his hand. He expressed his thanks again and earnestly asked about Aluo's whereabouts before retreating. The world of cultivators was a world where the strong ate their fill while the rest starved to death. Not to mention the cultivators who didn't reach the top, even the remaining second or third place cultivators weren't very happy, especially the third place cultivator. He had fought hard for his life, but in the end, the items that fell into his hands were leftovers. How useful could they be? This was their last night at Garan. Tomorrow, Xuanyuan's group would return home. Guangnen would stay here to recuperate and return on his own in the future. This was also a lesson for him. Among all the major cultivator sects in the Fifth Ring, Xianyuan and Garan had a good relationship. Although they weren't close, they were trustworthy. Even if he was from the internal sword branch, how could Garan have any designs on a mere foundation establishment cultivator? At night, Lu Xiaoyi sat alone in a high pavilion. His heart was calm as he reflected on the various aspects of the 100 vying barges during the day. He hoped to find flaws and improve in the future. To be honest, there were only 2 flaws. They were also weak, so it was very difficult to improve. The first was his cultivation level. This was determined by his age, so there were no shortcuts to improve. The second was his methods. Compared to the diverse and varied methods of cultivators, the swordsman's methods were much more lacking. This was the contradiction between specialization and variety. It was impossible to reconcile, especially for foundation establishment cultivators like them. Their lives were limited, so they could only choose one of the two. The path of cultivation was very difficult. It wasn't only about fighting and killing. It also included many other aspects, such as escaping, hiding, identifying, all aspects. However, this was Xuanyuan's weak point. It hadn't changed much even after tens of thousands of years, and it wasn't something that could be controlled by one person. The 100 vying barges wasn't a real battle. It limited the cultivator's strength in many aspects. For example, spells could only be based on water. This was very unfair to cultivators who were skilled in other aspects, although cultivators should adapt to any environment. Wan Jinglu was in a difficult situation, and so was the swordsman. This was the real reason why the 2 powerful swordsmen were defeated here. The reason was very complicated, and it was the same for everyone. Apart from the cultivators of Sangarama, who had the advantage of being able to familiarize themselves with the waterfall all year round, it was a different experience for the other cultivators. They would have to experience many more unknown things in the future. This was cultivation. After the award ceremony, he went to see Aluo, Faidu, and a few other cultivators who were seriously injured by him. This was what Gu Chuan had specifically told him. Killing was killing, and visiting was visiting. This was Xuanyuan's style. You could look down on it as hypocrisy, but Xuanyuan's disciples couldn't ignore it. This was the reason why Xianyuan hadn't aroused the disgust of the Fifth Ring cultivators even though they had been killing fiercely for tens of thousands of years. This was a kind of cultivation style. It could be said that Xianyuan had cultivated for tens of thousands of years, and finally, people began to accept the fact that they could be more ruthless. This was actually a kind of psychological hint. It had to be said that Xianyuan was very far-sighted. When everyone thought of him as a thug, it was natural for him to be more ruthless. Have you ever seen a desperado who didn't hit hard? Chapter 352. It was late at night. Lu Xiaoyi was immersed in the lake when he sensed a figure approaching him. There must be a reason why there was no accident here. It was the young body cultivator who came in second place in 100 vying barges. Lu Xiaoyi was puzzled. Was he not convinced and wanted to test him? It was said that body cultivators were the bane of swordsmen. He really wanted to know how it worked. It was said that body cultivators could withstand flying swords, but that was the flying sword of the inner sword. It was the flying sword of other swordsmen. He really wanted to see how this person withstood his hidden scent of 4 seasons. But he was completely wrong. The young body cultivator did not have any ill intentions. Instead, he was embarrassed. I'm sorry to disturb your meditation. I'm Chui Shirtu from the Earth-Splitting Sect. I'm here to ask for a favor. If you're willing, Shirtu is willing to pay the price. Lu Xiaoyi was puzzled. Shirtu, is that what you call you? If you have something to say, you can say it. We'll see if it works or not. But now, how am I supposed to answer? Chui Shirtu was very straightforward. Body cultivators were similar to swordsmen in that they did not beat around the bush. Senior obtained a bead in 100 vying barges. I'm sure you know that the bead has potential. This thing is not as useful to body cultivators as it is to spell cultivators and swordsmen. I actually came to 100 vying barges because of this. Unfortunately, I'm not as good as you, so there's nothing I can say. I don't know if you want to use this bead for yourself or for a friend. If you need it, then I'll pretend I didn't say anything. If you don't give up, then I'll still be your friend. If you just took this bead by accident and didn't know where to use it, then Shirtu would like to make a deal with you. Lu Xiaoyi was interested. Oh, what kind of deal? I don't have any use for this bead, but that doesn't mean it's worthless. In fact, this bead is the rarest and most unique of the 6 items. Then I'll be honest with you. What do I get in return? In the eyes of orthodox Taoist Dharma cultivators, potential was an overdraft. It wasn't the orthodox Tao, and if it was used too frequently, it could damage a cultivator's Tao foundation. However, this problem did not exist for body cultivators. Their strength came from their bloodline and body, and they had their own set of recovery techniques. Therefore, to them, the key was how to squeeze out their greatest potential. This kind of bead was very important to them. Lu Xiaoyi's meaning was that he was willing to trade, but he had to show him the value of the trade, and not take out a pile of useless junk to make up the numbers. Cultivators' trades were all about benefits, and would not change just because of admiration or because they had fought together. He was not that naive. Chui Shirtu was very straightforward. Originally, I wanted to use the 2 items I got from 100 vying barges to trade for this bead, but now that I think about it, it's not appropriate. You didn't choose these 2 items at that time, and naturally, you don't like them. So, I'll use an ancient martial art that I got from an adventure to trade with you. Lu Xiaoyi laughed in his heart, but he didn't show it on his face. Xian Yuan had so many martial arts, and he didn't lack a martial art. He didn't even have the time to cultivate, so how could he have the time to learn those so-called ancient martial arts? Chui Shirtu knew what he was thinking. As long as he was a disciple of a big sect, he wouldn't covet the so-called martial arts. However, he was very confident in his martial art, and was not afraid of being rejected by the swordsman. It was an ancient jade slip. If you didn't read it by sticking it to your forehead, it was just an ordinary reading technique. Chui Shirtu handed it over solemnly, not at all worried that the swordsman would have any bad intentions. In this regard, Xuanyuan's reputation was very trustworthy. This technique is actually related to force. It's called force removal. Lu Xiaoyi looked at the top of the jade slip. The 2 ancient seal characters were very eye-catching, force removal. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his crotch. Of course, this force removal wasn't the same as force removal. It was a technique that weakened the force removal of another cultivator, or even erased it. Interesting. Lu Xiaoyi continued to read and found that this thing was indeed very ancient. It was so ancient that it could be traced back to before the 5 rings were established, when this place was still called the Sirius star system. He didn't know where it was hidden, and it was actually obtained by Chui Shirtu. After a closer look, he found that the force removal technique was divided into 2 parts. The small part was to remove the force removal of external objects. The jade slip also clearly stated that if someone borrowed the force removal of mountains, rivers, wind, or rain, it would be very difficult to remove it completely from the perspective of force removal. It might even be impossible to remove it. The so-called force removal technique was most important in the latter part of the technique. It was force removal that was imposed on one's body by others. For example, force suppression, killing force, spiritual force, and so on. As long as it directly affected a cultivator's body, there were specific ways to remove it. He was very engrossed in reading, and Cui sure too didn't rush him. He wasn't worried that he would go back on his word after reading all the contents. This wasn't a real swordsman. How could a fake swordsman be a winner of 100 vying barges? The more a swordsman read, the more interested he was, and the more likely he was to trade. If he threw it back after reading the title of the book, that would be really troublesome. He could not find anything valuable on him anymore, and this bead was really something he yearned for day and night. It was very important to his system. Lu Xiaoyi obviously couldn't read it all shamelessly. After reading one or two of the tricks, he could basically confirm its authenticity. It was indeed very insightful. Don't go off the beaten path, don't go off the beaten path. He wasn't worried that it was a fake. Swordsmen had strength of character, and body cultivators weren't petty. This thing was too ancient and difficult to tamper with. Moreover, it was too late to change it in such a short time, unless the serious cultivator who left the inheritance deliberately lied. Very well, I'll trade. Lu Xiaoyi was very straightforward. He directly threw the pearl to Cui Shi Tu. Cui Shi Tu carefully received it. He treated it like a treasure and couldn't put it down. He thanked Cui Shi Tu gratefully. Thank you, senior brother. Shi Tu is a straightforward person. If you need my help in the future, just ask. Lu Xiaoyi didn't need his help. There were countless swordsmen in the dome. If they really needed help, the sect would be finished. Shi Tu, you don't have to thank me. In my opinion, this force removal technique is more useful than the pearl. Why don't you work on it? If you really learn it, it'll be even more useful than the pearl. The reason why he said this was because this ancient jade slip was the type of jade slip that had its own spirituality. However, it was not passed down through a forehead sticker. Instead, it would be protected according to how many people studied it. After a lot of reading, this jade slip would eventually become a blank jade slip, leaving no traces behind. Cui Shi Tu smiled bitterly. Good question, senior brother. Actually, I also know the rarity of this force removal technique, but I can't practice it. It's best to practice it with the orthodox Taoist method. You swordsmen can also make do with it. However, my body cultivator's method is special. I can't practice it at all. So after I learned it, I couldn't learn it. That's why I wanted to trade with senior brother. Chapter 353. P.S. Old Man Wenwu said to round up the results. Since Old Sloth has won, let's celebrate for the 10,000 votes. Also, please check your ballot boxes. If you have a vote, please vote. If you don't use it, you will be punished. If you don't vote when the time is right, you will be punished. Also, don't buy a ticket. We came here with nothing, but we will leave with nothing. After the 100 vying barges event, Xuanyuan's group returned. Only the inner sword Guangnan was missing. Martial Uncle Gu Chuan didn't show any expression. He wasn't angry because the inner sword was injured, nor was he happy because his disciple won. He was still silent as usual. Well, if he showed any signs of intimacy, Lu Xiaoyi wouldn't know how to deal with him. Everyone on the airship was silent. It was supposed to be a happy journey back, but because of the unexpected result, it became a bit awkward. The senior who was eager to try was slapped in the face by the younger generation. Xianyuan was too big, and there were too many people. It was impossible to spoil everyone. Everyone was meditating and cultivating. That was good. Lu Xiaoyi was concentrating on observing the three sword spirits advancing dauntlessly in Bo Lang Slope. He had no interest in making friends with any of them. That didn't make sense. Could it be that the more powerful one got, the more carefree one became? For seasons, he was about to break through the second stage. The airship landed on Wenguang Peak. Everyone went back to their own homes. Lu Xiaoyi was stopped by Gu Chuan. Do you know why I called you? Lu Xiaoyi guessed. There are rewards in the sect? Gu Chuan was speechless. This little outer sword was in the spirit stone's eyes. It was so straightforward that it was cute. It was just short of reaching out and asking for the spirit stone. Could the sect give it to him? Gu Shan should be the one to give it to him. I heard that you once came to Fan Lu to ask for a martial art? Lu Xiaoyi nodded. Yes, it was Martial Uncle Gu Pa who allowed me to benefit a lot. The success of the 800 vying barges was also due to Fan Lu's martial art. I have always been fascinated by the inner sword. My admiration for it is like a torrential river. Furukawa immediately cut him off. All right, don't try this in front of me. Save your flowery words for others. You have brought glory to Xianyuan in 800 vying barges. This is an indisputable fact. From the perspective of the inner sword branch, we will never mistreat disciples who have fought for glory for the sect, even if you are from the outer sword branch. Forget about the spirit stones. That's a matter for your Thousand Virtues Peaks inscription hall. On behalf of the inner sword sect, I'll grant you another chance to enter the Fan Tower. I will leave a letter to Senior Brother Fan Lu regarding this matter. If you want to come, you can directly register. Lu Xie was beaming with joy. He bowed to Furukawa once again to express his gratitude before he left. This guy has the face of a dog. If there are benefits, he's like a flower, but if there aren't, he's baring his fangs. Furukawa judged as he watched the young swordsman leave. However, the external swordsman might really be able to produce a character this time. The weak point was their cultivation. This was also the pain of the Xianyuan swordsmen. Their path of advancement was not as easy as that of a magic cultivator. Therefore, who could say for sure how far they could go? There were too many people who were outstanding at the foundation establishment stage, but had no hope of reaching the upper stage, or had faded into obscurity after reaching the Jin Dan stage. The first thing Lu Shi had to do when he came back was to divide the two items that he was holding onto. He didn't choose to invite the two to a feast before splitting the loot. Yenbo had a bad temper. When he saw that his little brother had become successful, he would get jealous. Then, he would stubbornly insist on comprehending on his own, causing his senior sister to reject him. This was all because of his face. However, it was very difficult for Yenbo to change this habit of his. Therefore, he chose to use the same City Express delivery. Yes, it was called Taoist child delivery in this place. There was an advantage to using this method. If they didn't meet each other, it would be very difficult for their friends to look away when they saw the items. Furthermore, it was very impolite to return a gift from a friend. Really, sending something was so troublesome. He had nothing better to do. When Du Shan saw him, he smiled so widely that only his teeth could be seen. He was very proud of his choice. After teaching and educating people for so many years, the thing that gave him the most satisfaction was that his disciples were successful. This was a sense of accomplishment that was difficult for outsiders to understand. For an old Jin Dan like him, who had no hope of reaching the upper stage, this was his only pursuit. I have good news and bad news. Which one do you want to hear? Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. How old are you? Why are you still playing this game? Can I only listen to the good news? No! Gu Shan handed over a storage ring. 100 top-grade items. How is it? The Ming Chuan Hall is dafa better than the Ascension Hall, right? This time, it was Lu Shi's turn to see the teeth but not the eyes. Of course. When I saw you, I felt that you were naturally powerful and heroic. You're both hall masters, but why is there such a big difference between you? This disciple thinks that the Ming Chuan Hall has wronged you. You should go to the Sword Chi Soaring Pavilion. Tens of thousands of Foundation establishment cultivators are waiting for your leadership. If there's nothing else, this disciple will take his leave. Gu Shan stopped him. Why are you running? You're cramping the moment you hear bad news. Are my swordsmen so irresponsible? Actually, it might not be bad news. It's just that junior brother Gu Lin from the Dark Hall asked me to inform you to go to his place when you return. Lu Xiao frowned. Dark Hall? Their mission scope is not in the western regions. They're all outside the Wolf Ridge. If this isn't bad news, then what is? Gu Shan smiled. Maybe they saw your outstanding performance and rewarded you with 100 top-grade items? Lu Xiao felt that things weren't going to be easy. The Dark Hall was actually called the External Hall in some sects. They were responsible for infiltration, assassination, subversion, chaos, sowing discord, slander, and other shady missions. Just like the inexplicable Ming Xiyuan he had killed at the Spear Point town. If the Dark Hall really gave him a mission, he would be better off in the western region. But if he passed the Wolf Ridge, he would be a homeless child. He didn't want to go, but he knew that since he was in this net, he couldn't avoid such troubles. Where could he hide? Although Gu Shan's tone was joking, the meaning behind his words was not a joke. In Xianyuan, fleeing in the face of an enemy was a serious crime. It was punishable by death. He realized that if he didn't get to the bottom of this matter, he wouldn't even be able to return to his cave and cultivate normally. He had to know the exact truth, even if it was a mission that would definitely kill him. Only then would he feel at ease. He had already realized that in Xianyuan, there was a force that was faintly pushing him outside. It wasn't forcing him to leave, but it was forcing him to fight. He still had to wait 10 months before he could give birth to a child. These missions came one after another. He didn't even have time to cultivate normally. Wasn't this forcing him to a dead end? Of course, he didn't know that the information about his problem was all vague and contradictory. There was no coordination. An unreliable perfected cultivator went to the void of the universe after passing down a certain instruction. It was unknown if he could come back in one piece. An unreliable Yuaning perfected cultivator didn't understand the essence behind the vague instruction after receiving it. The result was that the vague information became even more vague. The Jin Dan below him went about their own business. They blew their own trumpets and played their own tunes. Ascension Hall, Mingchuan Hall, Dark Hall. What Lu Xiao didn't know was that there were still many halls that hadn't been completed yet. He had the hope of becoming the busiest Foundation establishment swordsman in Xianyuan for the past 10,000 years. Moreover, these were all really difficult missions. Fortunately, he didn't know. Otherwise, he would definitely betray Xianyuan. Chapter 354. P.S. It's already September. Sloth must be tired as well. After a month of explosive growth, I'll be able to write more than 10,000 words a day. This is the effect of having a stockpile of manuscripts, not my ability. From September onwards, I'll be writing 3 chapters a day, 2 in the morning and 1 in the evening. Let's see if everyone can read more during the 11th. As for the monthly votes, it's fine to vote now. There's no need to wait until the end of the month to double the votes. We won't be able to win even at the end of the month. Asking for monthly votes without updating is a little unreasonable. Seeing that Sloth is working so hard in August, please forgive me. Sloth will sing a fat song for everyone here. Lu Xiao went straight to the Dark Hall. He was like a dead pig that wasn't afraid of boiling water. This was the first time he came to the Dark Hall. Normally, he would avoid this place, afraid that he would be targeted by some stupid Jin Dan and be sent out for a mission. In the end, after hiding for so many years, he still couldn't avoid it. Since he was already here, there was nothing to be afraid of. His attitude was also very impolite. After all, he was going to be exhausted to death. Why should he be polite? There's a mission that was set a few months ago. Because it was still early, I didn't inform you to avoid disturbing your state of mind. Only after I found out that you went to 100 vying barges did I realize that the difficulty of this mission had far exceeded the scope of what it should be. However, the mission had already been announced, and there was no way to change it. So, thank you for your hard work, Gu Lin said apologetically. However, he couldn't even be bothered to show the least bit of sincerity. It's not hard at all. I'm serving Xian Yuan. I just want to know if the other tens of thousands of Foundation establishment cultivators outside the Sword Sect will be jealous of me taking all the missions. Lu Xiaoyi did not have any scruples. It would be best if he could be punished for disrespecting his teacher and reflect on his mistakes in seclusion for 10 years. Gu Lin's expression did not change. It was normal for the disciples under him to feel conflicted about the missions. Everyone was here to cultivate, not to complete missions. When there was a lack of resources or boredom, the disciples would take the initiative to complete missions. However, when the sect forced them to do so and delayed their cultivation, it was inevitable that they would complain. Becoming a real swordsman requires a process, and not many people in the Foundation building stage can do it. You can't expect them to sacrifice everything for Xuanyuan's ideals, especially for this group of foreign cultivators. You want them to forget that humiliating experience in just a few decades? What are you thinking? Subduing a demonic beast required 8 to 10 years of training before it would truly submit to him, let alone a human. Therefore, he had to let the facts speak for themselves. I don't know about the other halls, but in the Dark Hall, there are more than 200 dangerous missions every year, and we select the best disciples to go on them. You've been in Xianyuan for nearly 30 years, right? Giving you a slightly more dangerous mission in 30 years, and on the premise that you have already shown your strength, I want to ask you, is it too much? Lu Xiaoyi was rendered speechless. There was no power that you could ask for without giving your all. Since the other party was using data to speak, he could only shut up. Gu Lin was very satisfied. He had seen many of these young fellows. Which of the disciples who were ranked at the top of the outer sword rankings weren't troublemakers when they were young? Who was easy to control? In front of his data, they all had to obediently bow their heads to him. Of course you can refuse. Xianyuan has never forced its disciples to do things they don't want to do. As long as you feel that it's right to live in Xianyuan, it's right for your growth. Lu Xiaoyi was defeated. These hall masters of the Soaring Sky Hall were harder to fool than the other. They were all cunning old foxes, and as soon as they spoke, they would make it seem like you were the one who asked for it. After the foreplay, Gu Lin began to get to the point. The mission came from half a year ago, and it will begin in 2 years. Because there was still plenty of time, and because we didn't want to disturb your state of mind, we didn't tell you in advance. However, you are indeed the disciple we chose. This was before that old bastard Gu Shan sent you on 100 vying barges. The mission location is in the Arai region. There is a sect that has a deep relationship with us, and they had a conflict with other sections. After many years of conflict, we finally decided to use a competition between our disciples to decide who you belong to. Lu Xiaoyi listened quietly. This mission seemed to be very unusual. There were some disputes in the fifth ring, and because there were no Yuanying or higher cultivators involved, most of the disputes were between the middle and low-level disciples. It was also a way to cultivate their ability to deal with matters and fight. It would save them from wasting a lot of resources to become a good-for-nothing who couldn't handle matters. In short, the outer space belonged to the great cultivators, and the inner space belonged to the small fries. As long as you didn't go to the other sects to cause trouble, this rule was set. The middle and low-level disciples were, of course, Jin Dan and Zhuji. The Jin Dan were cunning. They knew that the direction of the great Tao was still in the outer space. Therefore, although they couldn't go out, their hearts had already flown out. They couldn't ignore the inner space, but they couldn't devote themselves to it either. If they knew that their future was in the void universe, who would still work hard on the surface? They weren't ignorant cultivators from the middle and low-level cultivation worlds. They didn't know about the brilliance of the outer space and thought that their world was everything. Therefore, most of the time, the Zhuji cultivators were at the front, while the Jin Dan cultivators were at the back waving paper fans. This also explained why most of the activities in the fifth ring were focused on the Zhuji cultivators. Gu Lin continued, The specifics of the competition are still to be decided, but there's one point. Allies can be found in this dispute. Of course, they must be allies from the inner space. This is why we're sending you. Lu Xiaoyi didn't understand. Martial uncle, they must be allies from the Arai region? Then if I carry such a big sword case, won't I be telling others that I'm from the Xianyuan region? Don't tell me I have to take the sword case and compete with them in spells? Gu Lin handed over a jade scroll. The details are in there. Go and read it yourself. Is the Dark Hall's arrangement so unreliable? The journey is long, so you need to leave early. Take care of the time. Don't make a fool of yourself if you're late and let others talk. And it's a long-term mission? It seems like I don't need to worry about the guarding position of Spear Point Town anymore? It's a mess. The halls of Sword Chi soar through the clouds don't communicate with each other. The disciples are the ones who are tired. After returning to the cave, he carefully studied the jade scroll. He finally understood the meaning behind Gu Lin's words. In the Arai region, carrying a sword case wasn't a big deal. This was because there was the largest sect with pure external swords in the fifth ring, Weijian Mountain. The power that asked for help wasn't Weijian Mountain, but another medium-sized power in the Arai region, Kun Daoli Realm. This name didn't sound like the name of a sect. Instead, it sounded more like a realm. In fact, this was a pure Kun cultivator power. It originated from a realm in the Zhuozhou star system called Kun Daoli Realm. They also participated in the Sirius expedition. After they succeeded, they established their own circle of power in the fifth ring. Because their power was limited, they used the power of the entire realm to support this framework. Therefore, they were called Kun Daoli Realm. They were the ones who encountered the trouble. There was nothing they could do. Being weak was a sin. Top sects wouldn't have so much trouble. Instead, they were the ones looking for trouble. The opponents of Kun Daoli Realm found Arai's biggest top power, the three pure ones, to rely on. They had no choice but to find helpers. The helpers were Weijian Mountain, who had a close relationship with Kun Daoli Realm. This was a very long history. Whether it was Kun Daoli Realm or Weijian Mountain, they were Xuanyuan's most loyal and powerful allies in Arai. Even their close relationship was facilitated by Xianyuan. Xianyuan would never stand by and do nothing when it came to allies. Therefore, this happened. Xianyuan sent a strong external swordsman to infiltrate Weijian Mountain's group of swordsmen to help Kun Daoli Realm. Chapter 355. It was impossible for Xuanyuan's inner sword to participate in this mission because Weijian Mountain did not have any inner swords. Only Xianyuan in the western region and Firmament Sword sect in the southeastern region had inner swords. Based on the principle that outsiders were not allowed to interfere in internal disputes, only Xuanyuan's outer swords could enter. Xuanyuan's Outer Sword Foundation Establishment Group had more than 20,000 people and Weijian Mountain's Foundation Establishment Group had more than a few thousand people. It was impossible for everyone to be under the surveillance of the spell cultivators, except for those who were famous and had a place in the rankings. Outsiders were not allowed to interfere in internal disputes. This was the principle, but principles were meant to be broken. Among the top sects in the fifth ring, who would really care about principles? As long as you did it cleverly, covertly, and not ostentatiously. In Xuanyuan's Foundation Establishment Group, the inner swords were the most valued by the spell cultivators, followed by the outstanding disciples of the outer swords. Lu Xiaoyi was a newly advanced expert, and his reputation had not been spread far and wide. He was not on the rankings now. Even if someone noticed the rise of Xuanyuan's outer sword, it was difficult to match his reputation with his face. Therefore, he had an advantage in going to Arai. He was strong enough and had a good face. He was suitable for this kind of dirty business. He did not need to change his identity as a Weijian Mountain swordsman. His original appearance was good enough. His actions and skills were all the same. It was flawless. His new identity was a Weijian Mountains Foundation establishment disciple who had been in the sect for 30 years. He usually kept a low profile and rarely interacted with others. His thoughts were strange. One time, he stabbed himself to death while practicing his sword. The specific reason was unknown. It seemed like he was studying the problem of spear and shield. The embarrassing thing was that his spear was much sharper than his shield. What was worse was that not only did he have to cross the Wolf Ridge, but he also had to cross countless Heise in the Arai region. Even if no accidents happened on the way, the journey would take years. Even if he set off now, he did not have enough time. Could it be that Gulin treated him as a Jinan realm cultivator? Lord Jiao, can you send me to a fixed location in Arai? Lu Xiaoyi spoke of his troubles. Actually, he could have asked Gulin directly. However, he did not wish to do so. He had already guessed that this might be the Dark Hall's Hall Master making things difficult for him, a punishment for his disrespectful attitude. He just didn't want to do as he wished. If there's something you can't decide, ask Ninth Master. This had already become a habit of his. Ajia laughed when she heard this. He's deliberately trying to make things difficult for you. From here, if you were to fly on your own, with the speed of an old cow pulling a broken carriage, I estimate that you would need to fly for at least 5 years to reach your destination if there were no mishaps along the way. How could this be? The sect would even let Jin Dan take you to Temple. Asking a Foundation establishment cultivator to run a 5-year journey, are you courting death? He wants you to be submissive. Let me tell you, you can't go. You're under the protection of Lord Jiao. How can you lower your head and apologize to a small Jin Dan? You can't go. Lu Xiaoyi felt the same way. I don't want to go. But this mission, should I just give up? If the sect blames me, Ajia said, blames my ass. The dome is so far away from Dinghai and the Kuandao separation boundary. How can a Foundation establishment cultivator go there? Don't worry. With the relationship between Xianyuan and Weijian Mountain, they are in the same boat. There will be a teleportation array between them. That will happen in an instant. Just hold on like this. On the last day of the agreed date, find them to teleport. It's their business if they don't want to. Ajia explained a little. Only then did Lu Xiaoyi know that there was such a system in the Fifth Ring. A teleportation array was not a big deal for a cultivation world like the Fifth Ring. There was no bottleneck in terms of resources or technology. The only obstacle was the human heart. If Xianyuan opened his teleportation array everywhere, not only in the western regions, but also in the southeast regions and the Air-Sea region, it meant that the sword lunatics could appear anywhere in the Fifth Ring at any time. This was a great hidden danger for the local sections. Would they still be able to sleep well? Similarly, Xianyuan would not be willing to open the teleportation array of the Supreme Three Pure Ones to the western regions. It was the same reason. In fact, for the major cultivators of Yuanying and above, this was also a precaution. However, the cultivation world would not really let go of the direct connection between each other because of this. Therefore, teleportation arrays were not common in the Fifth Ring continent. For example, in the western regions, instead of setting up teleportation arrays in the cities, it was better to let the middle and low-level cultivators fly around. They could also train their abilities and increase their knowledge. As for crossing the Wolf Ridge, Xianyuan did not encourage Foundation establishment cultivators to challenge such a natural barrier. It was meaningless. However, while the top sects could stop their opponents from setting up teleportation arrays in their own regions, they could not stop their opponents from setting up teleportation arrays in the mountains of their allies. This was especially true for a stable alliance like the Three Swords Alliance. In the Xianyuan Sword Sect, Weijian Mountain, and Firmament Sword Sect, teleportation arrays were necessary between each other. They could form an army of swordsmen at any time to fight against the Dharma orthodoxy, which had an absolute advantage in terms of overall numbers. This was the most convenient shortcut for Xianyuan disciples to go to other regions. Of course, to use the teleportation array, one had to have the approval of the higher-ups. They had to have a real mission and not go there to buy a few pounds of Air C's famous prawns to eat. This was the correct way for Lu Shi to go over. Gu Lin did not say anything because he wanted him to go back and admit his mistake. Jiu Yi, can you do this too? I can't. My ability is only in the western regions, within the range of Xuanyuan's influence. If you go too far, I can't catch you back. There are countless supremes in the five-ring continent, and there are many who can restrict my spatial ability. Jiu lied. In fact, the ability that it was best at, the true ability that was trained by its master countless times, was basically a routine: send its master out to play, bring him back when he caused trouble and ran away. However, after thinking about it, it finally understood that the success of its former master was not necessarily the success of the current Lu Xiaoyi. Its so-called escape route was not necessarily a good thing for a young man who was on the rise. It was the same no matter how one looked at it. Not only would it make the cultivator lose the will to fight to the death, it would also not serve as a real protection. People who could cause trouble were like this. When you told them a safe bottom line, they would definitely try to go under the bottom line. It was better not to say anything and adapt to the situation. It could also be a little restrained. By now, Jiu could see that this kid had never regarded it as his last resort. He even rarely entered the world of 9 palaces during normal cultivation. He had his own ideas, his own path, and it would also make him who he was. This was not something that it, as a realm spirit, could decide. It was also the foundation that humans were the spirits of all realms. Now, it had finally found its own position. It did not have to say too much. When he needed it, it would lend a hand and then silently watch him. Chapter 356. Lu Xiaoyi calmed down. What was coming couldn't be avoided. Since he couldn't resist, he could only seize the time to enrich himself. Closing the door and rejecting all invitations, greetings, and visits gave him a reputation of being unreasonable, but he didn't care anymore. Only true friends understood him, such as Yan Bo and Yan Heng. They didn't even express their gratitude for receiving gifts. Some concerns didn't need to be thanked. When friends needed help, it was enough to be present. Lu Xiaoyi filled his cultivation schedule to the brim. Not only did he abuse himself, he also abused the 3 sword spirits. The poor 3 little fellows were whipped like spinning tops by him all day long. They couldn't stop at all. They spent their days in the turbulent waves of Bolang Slope, surfing the waves and riding the waves. A year later, Lu Xiaoyi's extreme pressure paid off. The 3 sword spirits broke through one after another. The 4 seasons in Zhu City broke through the 2nd stage and began to attack the 3rd. Hidden Fragrance also successfully broke through the 1st stage. The benefit of breaking through was that the sword spirits were even more powerful. They could also inscribe sword formations on their own flying swords. At this point, the 4 seasons in Zhu City flying swords had already inscribed 11 layers of sword formations. This was already the highest level in the Boa Tower. However, Lu Xiaoyi's sword formation was different from those sword techniques. His sword formation was jointly researched by himself and the sword spirits. It had already broken away from Xuanyuan's old framework and was no longer in the same system. This was the profound change brought to him by the sword spirits. There were still many things to be busy with. He had to dig deeply into the power of the stars. At the very least, he had to reach the limit of the foundation establishment stage. The study of the power of the stars was also an important part of the battle. He had to use the Big Dipper and Shenhou flying swords to complete tens of thousands of strikes a day. This was the true essence of the sheep horn technique. He could feel his own progress. Although it was slow, it was unwavering. Lu Xiaoyi's personality had a stubborn side. Since he wanted to obtain something, he wasn't stingy with his efforts. If 10,000 strikes a day wasn't enough, then 10,000 strikes, 100,000 strikes. He liked the feeling of pure power. When the flying swords drew a perfect curve in the sky, they fully displayed the essence of the sword. This made him intoxicated. Right now, he had already forgotten about spell techniques. This was the charm of the sword. For Lu Xiaoyi, after nearly 30 years of practicing the sword, he had already figured out a set of sword techniques that belonged to him. It was a sword technique system that suited his ideals. Unlike others who liked to gradually increase the power of their attacks during testing, he valued the first sword very much. It would be best if the first strike could break through his defense and end the battle. Even if he couldn't end it, he had to make the other party suffer a huge loss or shock. And because of this, in the following battle, his hands and feet were tied, and he did not dare to use his full strength. He always had to reserve some mana to prepare for his heavy sword attack. This actually created some kind of psychological threat. This was not the power of intimidation, but it achieved the effect of intimidation from another angle. A battle was nothing more than two aspects, one's own performance, and the other's performance. If he could make his opponent feel apprehensive and not dare to use his full strength, he would have achieved his goal. Therefore, the first strike was very important to him. Others would leave their trump card for the end, but he chose to leave it at the beginning. As for what would happen if the first three axes didn't work, and it was time for someone else to use their trump card? Actually, it was very simple. Run! If your most powerful attack couldn't do anything to your opponent, then what else could you do but run? Wait for your opponent to put friendship first? This method of his was very effective in the 100 vying barges. The reason why he was able to move forward without any obstruction was because he did not care about anything and used all his strength in every strike. This kind of swordsmanship was not taught to him by anyone, it was something that he was born with. There was no need to think, it was something that should be done. Swordsmen's battle tactics were very strange. They mainly relied on their own unique abilities and set up some fixed combinations accordingly. They were still not at the level where they could do it so casually, naturally, and perfectly in tune with their surroundings. Therefore, they needed to come up with different battle tactics. For example, how to attack a spell practitioner, how to probe, how to find an opportunity, what kind of flying sword combination, strength combination, attribute combination, to find a chance to win. What to do against a body practitioner. What to do against a fellow swordsman. These were all things that needed to be weighed and calculated. It was not as simple as just throwing out all the flying swords that one knew in a daze. Generally speaking, this was a style that a swordsman slowly formed after 50 years of foundation building. It was because their horizons were broadened, their knowledge was broadened, and they had experienced many battles. They also had a set of flying swords that they refined themselves. Only then could they have their own battle characteristics and battle tactics. Only then could they truly possess a certain level of battle prowess. Because Lu Xiaoyi had a sword spirit, he was able to form a system earlier. However, it was also because he formed his battle style earlier that he had an extra burden. The more battles he fought, the more time he had to practice his swordsmanship. As a result, the most important aspect of a cultivator's cultivation level was weakened. Of course, compared to other cultivators at the same time, he was not weak. However, compared to the normal circumstances of the missions that he faced, he was weak. For missions like crossing the Wolf Ridge like this, Xian Yuan would usually send a late-stage foundation-building swordsman to carry them out. They would not choose a mid-stage foundation-building cultivator like him. This was also a form of protection. However, for some reason, this protection was ineffective when it came to him. He felt that his position in Xuanyuan's sword faction was very strange. It was not like an ordinary foundation-building cultivator should be. There was always someone taking care of him. It was not the care of spirit stones or resources. It was another kind of situation. It was like a landlord waking up in the middle of the night to ask his workers to work. This was a feeling that he could not be sure of. In the upper echelons of Xianyuan, he still did not have a trustworthy backer. He had never thought of finding himself a master. This was also a deep-rooted concept. It was not because of any specific reason, but because he did not need one. He believed that he could take care of himself. In the dark hall, Gu Lin sighed. His fate with this young swordsman was broken. He did not tell him how to teleport. It was not because he was petty. He just wanted to teach this disrespectful young man a lesson. In Xianyuan, being young and impetuous was not a crime. The real reason was that he wanted to take in a disciple. He had some understanding of this young man. He had a very strange experience, and a very shocking battle record. This made him see a trace of something unusual. It made him, who had never taken in a disciple before, feel a trace of impulse. In Xianyuan, the master chose the disciple, and the disciple also chose the master. This was a two-way process. Of course, the master's opinion was more important. With a master, not only would one have a teacher that could be consulted at any time, it was also equivalent to having a mountain of resources. The little amount of resources for a foundation-building cultivator was nothing in the eyes of a Jin Dan. It was precisely because of this that the Jin Dan and Yuanying in Xianyuan had very high standards when it came to choosing a disciple. They were not interested in wasting precious resources on a mediocre person. Gu Lin left this guide in hopes that the young man would come to him. After spending more time together, some things could be expressed naturally. There was no need to say it directly. If it did not work out, everyone would feel awkward. However, this young man did not come. 10 days had already passed. He must have already studied the mission jade slip. It was impossible that he did not consider the itinerary. The reason why he did not come was that he had thought it through, or someone had told him. Taking in a disciple was also a matter of fate. It was just like looking for a Tao companion. What you wanted, he would not come. What came was not what you wanted. Gu Lin sighed and gave up on this idea. His luck was terrible when it came to Tao companions and disciples. There was nothing he could do. Chapter 357. P.S. Please guarantee the minimum monthly votes. Thank you for your support. In addition, I guess you can't learn from Wen and Wu and hit people when they are down. Sloth can't take it anymore. Ting Sea, a beautiful sea. Fa Ting Island, a beautiful island. In the huge Fifth Ring Road, it was not unusual for an island to have a sea border of nearly 10,000 miles. This came from the special geographical environment of the Fifth Ring Road. There was no real sea in the Fifth Ring Road. Among the three major areas, only the air-sea area was close to the sea. However, it was also half of the island, which was embedded with each other, like a huge platter. The earthy green land and the dark blue sea were separated in the middle, which was spectacular. The surrounding area of Ting Sea was the territory of Qin Dao Lijia. Generally speaking, it belonged to the larger medium-sized forces. This was not completely a symbol of their strength, but the result of a series of accidents after the expedition to Sirius and the establishment of the Fifth Ring Road. Strength was more important than territory. People like Xianyuan were very good at controlling the situation. In a short period of time, he wiped out all the mutants in his territory. The surrounding forces didn't dare to question him. Under the sword, there was the truth. Those whose strength was not worthy of such a large territory were very difficult to support. The territory of Qin Dao Lijia was only half of Xuanyuan's, but their strength was only 1/10 or 2/10 of Xuanyuan's. Such difficulties could be imagined. Since the establishment of the Fifth Ring Road, they had been struggling to survive. This was also a harsh reality. The various forces in the cultivation world would not be soft-hearted just because they were all women. Instead, they would be more and more oppressed. When the Fifth Ring Road was established, Qin Dao Lijia also had the idea of giving up part of their territory to gain relative stability. However, they were persuaded by their powerful ally, Xianyuan. Xianyuan said very clearly, even if you want to give up land to ask for peace, you have to have land to give up. A big cake could always last for a few more years, but how many times could a bun be cut? The cultivation world would never decide whether to attack you based on the size of your territory. They only looked at your strength. With the strong support of Xianyuan and the help of Weijian Mountain, which was also in Irai, the Kun-Dao separation boundary finally persevered. For tens of thousands of years, although they had never expanded their territory and occasionally made peace in some small disputes, on the whole, there was no big change. It was really not easy for them to do this with their strength. Tempering could make a person grow, and it could also make a force strong. After 10,000 years, the women of Kun-Dao world had gradually adapted to the rhythm here. They put aside their former indifference to the world and completely integrated into the big furnace of cultivation. This was an improvement. How could cultivation always be indifferent to the world? Just one calamity would be enough to defeat them, who had never experienced wind and rain. Of course, a strong ally was always the most important. This was also the reason why most of the Dao companions of Kun-Dao world's cultivators were swordsmen. If all of the Dao companions of Kun-Dao world's cultivators were pulled out, it would also be a powerful force. Ordinary forces might not be able to withstand it. Most of them were from Weijian Mountain because they were the closest to each other. Next was Xianyuan swordsmen. Although their relationship was the deepest, the distance was too far. Without contact, how could they be close? The secret transmission array between the sects could not be used as a bridge for these lonely men and women to satisfy their needs for the weekend. Han Yen straddled a small bamboo basket and stepped barefoot on a large patch of crab algae floating in the shallow sea outside Fangting Island. She was looking for the freshest crab algae tips after the beginning of spring. Her white clothes fluttered in the wind, and there was no ripple in the water. Her picturesque eyebrows were picturesque, and she blended perfectly with nature in the beautiful scenery of Fangting Island. This was an indescribable and extremely clean beauty. It was as if she was nature. She was so natural that the fishes under the crab algae would not be frightened away. Instead, they would circle around her bare feet, playing and following her as she walked. The crab algae tips were the main ingredient of a type of pill. It was not an extraordinary pill, but because it was used in large quantities, the senior and junior sisters would often come here to pick it in the beginning of spring. The algae tips were hidden under the water. It required very good eyesight and gentle control to not destroy the roots of the crab algae. It would take 10 days to half a month for them to grow again. There were many other sisters like her, and they were all barefoot. They were barefoot because they could not rely too much on their magic power to fly, so as to avoid damaging the delicate algae tips underwater. Wearing shoes would make it easy to get wet, so it was better to go barefoot. There were no men here, so it was fine to be casual. The basket was also a special bamboo basket. It was good for preserving the medicinal power of the crab algae tips. This thing was very delicate, and could not be placed in a storage ring. It had to be kept in a natural environment to maintain the best medicinal power. Han Yen, after picking the algae tips, let's go to the Flying Silk Pavilion to admire the flowers, okay? Every spring, there are pansies and cornflowers. It's really beautiful. Every year, I can't get enough of it. I wish I could live there. Unfortunately, the sect doesn't allow me to build an immortal's cave there. The one who spoke was called Tianlan. She was 16 years old and as beautiful as a flower. Of course, you couldn't really think that they were a group of budding young girls. Cultivation was the best beauty for women. Based on age alone, they might be a group of old demons. I like hyacinths and dodder. They are more elegant, more simple, without a trace of vulgarity. Fan Jin retorted. Another woman called Fan Jin retorted. They were all good sisters and had been cultivating together, harvesting crab algae and admiring flowers for decades. They were like a family to each other. This was also the strongest aspect of the Kun-Dao realm. Their cultivators often had a more cohesive force. Most of them had the mindset of pursuing the Tao alone for their entire lives. After all, those who became Tao companions were in the minority. I like them all. No matter if it's flowers, grass, birds, or fish, as long as it's a living thing. Han Yen smiled. She was already used to the two sisters bickering. It had already become a part of her life. However, there were more important things in life. But I don't want to go to the Flying Silk Pavilion. I want to go back and cultivate. Tianlan sighed and advised. Han Yen, the matters of the sect will be taken care of by the martial uncles and the others. At our level, it's actually very difficult for us to do anything. Why do you have to make things so difficult for yourself? Among the three of us, your Tao is the most profound. However, if you go up against those people, you might not be able to. Fan Jin also advised. The list of participants is set by the higher-ups. Everyone's abilities have long been seen by martial uncles. How much can you improve in these short 10 days? Actually, Han Yen, you don't have to be so worried. I heard martial uncles say in private that for this battle, Wei Sword Mountain will send a truly strong person. With the swordsman, what are you worried about? Han Yen frowned slightly. Her two sisters had already lost their minds due to the beauty of Bodingting Island. No matter how beautiful a place is, if you don't have the strength to protect it, how can it last long? I've already signed up. Today, I just want to ask martial uncles about the results. After all, it's our matter. Of course, Bodingting Island should be our priority. The sword vein has already helped us for tens of thousands of years. Can they still help us for tens of thousands of years? You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.